Hello, welcome to the sequel of What If Luffy Was Raised by WhiteBeard called What If Luffy Was Son of WhiteBeard. Please like and subscribe, 12 likes for next part. Enjoy. Luffy was really young when he first learned about Father's Day, but it was a tradition that had stuck with him throughout his childhood and even through his teenage years. "What are you doing, Luffy?" Sabo asked his little brother who was wandering around the island's town looking into each window carefully, then moving on with a sigh. "Looking for treasure," Luffy said simply before returning to what he was doing. "I doubt you'll find it in these windows," Sabo said, concerned with Luffy. "I found something last year like this," Luffy said, almost ignoring Sabo's words altogether, which bothered the blonde. "What kind of treasure are you looking for, Lu?" Ace asked, leaning over Luffy to look into the window as well, hoping he could understand what was going through his little brother's mind. "A special treasure," he said, moving on to the next window, leaving a confused and annoyed Ace behind him. "I didn't know he liked treasure so much," Sabo whispered to Ace, who also shrugged at the boy's antics. "This is Luffy, he can go from normal to weird in a few seconds flat," Ace said, and Sabo nodded, knowing that was the truth. Luffy wasn't sure of the treasure he was searching for, but all he knew was that it had to be special, since Pops was special to him. Completely forgetting about his brothers, Luffy continued to walk along the street, searching every store and window for that special treasure. "What's wrong with him now?" Ace scowled as Luffy began to talk with shop owners before leaving them and moving on to another. "What's wrong with who?" Thatch had come up and threw his arm over Ace's shoulders, leaning his chin down to talk into Ace's ear. "Luffy's acting weird, well, weirder than normal," Sabo said to Thatch, who got off of Ace and smiled at them. "Ah, so it's about that time again, isn't it?" he asked, looking towards the straw-hatted boy who was frowning at a pile of objects in a large basket. "What time would that be, Thatch?" Ace asked him, really wanting to know what the hell was going on. "Just keep watching," he said, winking at the boys before walking off towards a bar. "Of course he comes and gives us more questions rather than answers," Sabo said, glaring at the fourth commander as he left. "Maybe we should ask Marco if anyone knows Luffy best, it's him." So off they went, searching for Marco, who knew they would probably make their way to him sooner or later. "So you showed up, brats, yoi." Marco sighed, putting his pen down, knowing he wasn't getting any work done as long as two teenage brats were leaning against his doorframe. "What's happening with Luffy?" Ace wasn't going to waste any time figuring out what was going on this time. "Who knows, Luffy does strange things all the time, yoi." Marco really didn't want to give it away. Luffy took Father's Day seriously and enjoyed having his gifts being somewhat of a surprise. "Yeah, but this time he's being weirder than normal." Sabo frowned and crossed his arms, showing Marco they weren't giving up that quickly. "Sabo, you know how to use a calendar, right, yoi?" Marco asked Sabo, whose brow twitched in annoyance at the question. "I sense sarcasm in your voice, Mama Marco." Sabo scowled and Marco chuckled at the boy's tone. "Why not use that knowledge to see what day it just might be then, yoi?" he asked, pushing his chair back and stepping past the brothers who were now fully annoyed. "Maybe it's a day designed for everyone to act weird," Ace thought out loud, thinking how Luffy, Thatch and Marco were acting different than normal. "No, it's something else." Sabo sighed and brushed a few blonde strands of hair out of his face. "Seems like we'll have to go do our research, I guess." Sabo smiled. The men left the first commander's room to find out what was really going on. Marco headed to the town to find Luffy and see what he was looking for. Marco enjoyed messing with the boys' heads since he didn't usually get an opportunity to do so. When he saw Luffy, he couldn't help but chuckle because he now knew why the brothers were all worked up. "Did you find anything, Lu yoi?" Marco asked, coming up beside the boy who was frowning. "Nothing, this is harder than before," Luffy said, and Marco patted him on the head affectionately. "Why don't we look together then, yoi?" Marco said, and Luffy was glad to have his ma's help finding the perfect gift for his pops. Ace and Sabo had swarmed the library on the giant ship, looking up the date and what happens on this day. Sabo almost laughed when he saw it was Father's Day, while Ace just made a blank face. "I should have known it would be something silly like that," Sabo said, shaking his head, understanding now what Luffy was doing and why the crew was acting weird. "Father's Day," Ace said, his expression still blank, which caused Sabo to sigh and look at Ace sadly. "That man isn't your father, Ace," Sabo said to him, and Ace finally looked at him. "Pops is your dad now, just like he's mine. No one's expecting us to do something for this day. Heck, Pops has enough sons here to spoil him that he probably won't even notice we didn't participate," Sabo said, giving Ace his hand, hoping to cheer him up. "You're right," Ace said, not taking the hand but walked past Sabo out of the library. "What a stubborn guy." Sabo smiled softly and sadly. Thatch was returning from the bar after having a few drinks and so happened to stumble upon Ace, literally. "You know, it's not nice to sit somewhere where drunk people can trip on you, you know." Thatch scowled, picking himself up and glaring at Ace, who was pouting on the floor. "I didn't think you'd be drunk." Ace whispered, and Thatch shook his head at the fire user's attitude. What else would I be doing on a fine afternoon like this? Thatch asked, picking up a wrapped bottle of booze and checking to make sure it was alright after his wonderful trip. I take it that's for Pops? Ace asked, pointing to the wrapped bottle, and Thatch nodded with a smirk. You finally realized what's going on then? He asked Ace, helping the teenager up. Yeah, Marco got all sarcastic on us. Ace smiled, knowing a sarcastic Marco was a rarity. I wish I'd been there to see that. Thatch laughed, causing Ace to laugh as well. Yeah, but you were getting yourself drunk at the time. Ace was feeling a bit better, he knew Thatch would make him smile. So what's the deal, kid? You don't just hide and trip me for nothing. What's bothering you? Thatch was very watchful on the boys. They were all so young that he worried about them at times, but maybe it's him just getting old. Nah, it can't be that. What's so special about Father's Day? Ace asked, looking away from Thatch, which caused said man to laugh loudly. It's a day we celebrate having Pops in our lives. Look, kid, he doesn't care if we celebrate or not, and honestly, we didn't really celebrate much until Luffy came along. Thatch said in thought, which confused Ace. Why did you guys wait until you had Luffy to celebrate? He would have thought by the cheerfulness of this crew any excuse for a party would have been taken. Because every day was a party to us. When Luffy found out that there was a day set aside for fathers, he just had to do something about it. Thatch remembered the day little Luffy, only 4 years old, discovered Father's Day and the chaos that happened because he hadn't known before. That sounds just like Luffy. Ace said, thinking about how Luffy made sure to celebrate every holiday and birthday that came to pass. Ever since, Luffy has made sure to bring Pops a gift of some sort on this day, heck, even we got into the habit of doing it. Thatch lifted up the wrapped bottle as proof. Ops doesn't mind? Ace asked, and Thatch patted him on the head. He thinks Luffy is adorable like all of us do, but honestly, who doesn't like to be told they're great and have a day celebrated for them? Thatch asked, and Ace smiled. I don't think I'm ready to celebrate just yet, Ace admitted to Thatch, and the man smiled at Ace, leaning down to his level. There isn't any rush, Ace. Pops loves us all, and that includes you. If you want to celebrate, that's fine, if you don't, that's also fine. You're important to us, Ace, just as much as Pops is important to us. Thatch said, which made Ace feel really warm inside. Now I'm going to try and sober up a bit before Luffy gets back. Thatch said, waving to Ace and walking or a little bit stumbling away. Good luck with that one. Ace snickered, knowing full well that Thatch would probably give up on sobering and go for another drink instead. Feeling much better now, Ace decided to go find Sabo and tell him what he and Thatch had talked about. Luffy would probably be back shortly, and by the smells in the kitchen, there was likely to be a grand party tonight. Luffy had given up on the shops and decided that Marco should buy him some lunch to make up for it. And how is emptying my wallet making up for you not finding the perfect gift, Yoi? Marco asked, but honestly he didn't really care about money. I'm eating my feelings of disappointment. Luffy said through a few mouthfuls of meat. And where did you learn such a phrase? Marco was genuinely curious about that. No, can't really remember, eating right now. Luffy said, and Marco chuckled. Say Lou, I heard there's a waterfall close by, why don't we go check it out after this, Yoi? He knew Luffy needed to burn on the now refilled energy before they got back to the ship, since setting loose a hyper Luffy was not exactly welcome all the time. Really? Luffy asked, nibbling on the leftover meat from the bone before putting it down to look at Marco with stars in his brown eyes. Then let's go. Luffy was pulling Marco out of the restaurant rather quickly, so once outside Marco chose to take the lead from there. Do you have any idea where the waterfall is, Luffy, Yoi? Marco asked him, causing the kid to stop in his tracks and try and think about it. Nope. He shouted, proud of himself, which caused Marco to just shake his head at the boy. Then why don't you let me take you there, Yoi? Luffy, agreeing to that plan, followed Marco on a trail that led into the forest area of the island. We need to go off the trail now, Lou, you okay with that? Marco asked, and Luffy nodded in excitement. Keep close and watch your feet. The land was a bit soft and damp, which could cause the boy's feet to sink in. Roots and other plantation were also a danger to the boy, especially ones that had thorns on them. There it is, Yoi. Marco whispered, looking in front of him at the magnificent waterfall. Amazing. It's so cool. Luffy shouted before kicking his sandals off and running to the shallow end of the water. Careful, Lou, neither one of us can swim, Yoi. He reminded the boy, who nodded, but just to make sure he didn't do anything stupid, Marco would keep careful eye on him. I wish we could bring Pops and the others here. Luffy said as he splashed water into Marco's direction with a small laugh. That would be fun, we will have to do that before we leave this island, Yoi. Marco said, blocking another splash from the laughing boy. Marco was right when he thought the waterfall would be a good idea for Luffy to burn off his energy. Luffy was running through the shallow areas where the water just brushed to his ankles and playing in the sandy area. Ma! Luffy shouted at Marco, a large smile on his face as he turned his brown eyes towards his brother. Marco hummed, looking up at Luffy, who was crouched down, his hands in the water. What do you think about this? Luffy stood up, a small smooth rock in his hand, showing it to Marco. I think it's perfect, Yoi. Marco said, a smile on his face, looking at the treasure Luffy had found. I thought so as well. Can we go back now, Ma? I'm done playing in the water. Luffy said, and Marco nodded. Luffy wasn't that wet since Marco had made sure he didn't go too far in the water, so he would dry off quickly on their way back to the Moby Dick. Where have you guys been? Sabo asked, a tad bit annoyed since he had been wandering the town with Ace looking for them. Ma found a super cool waterfall, so I got to splash around a bit. Luffy said, his hand holding tight to the rock, keeping it safe. So did you find what you were looking for in one of the shops? Ace asked Luffy, and Luffy frowned, shaking his head. All the shops had was stupid junk or food. I like the food part, but I didn't want the junk. Luffy said, stepping past Ace and Sabo, leaving a grinning Marco behind him. So did you guys find anything? Sabo asked, knowing Luffy wasn't one to just give up so easily. Marco pointed to Luffy as if indicating for them to wait and watch. Pops. Luffy climbed up on the old man's lap, causing the older man to smile at the kid, knowing he was about to get a gift. Here you go, I found it with Marco. Luffy said, and dropped a smooth heart-shaped stone in the old man's hand. The stone had been shaped by age, and the water's tides, much like Pops himself, had been, so Marco thought it was a perfect gift for their father. Luffy, on the other hand, liked how it felt in his hands, and the shape was pretty cool. Happy Father's Day, Pops. Luffy cheered, and the old man laughed softly, patting the boy on the head, thanking him for the gift as the celebrations began. An old rock. He gave Pops a rock? Ace asked, confused, and Marco laughed at his expression. Pops doesn't care what we give him, a gift comes from the heart, and any gift from Luffy's heart is always special, no matter what it is, Yoi. Marco said. Next year we should do something. Ace said, and Sabo smiled at him. I guess we'll have to now, won't we? Sabo said, heading to find Harita to see what he can help with for the party. Luffy was lying in a small boat with Zoro sleeping on one end and Nami keeping her eyes on the clouds and waves. Luffy? She asked as he sat up suddenly and stretched, giving a loud yawn in return. That was a good memory. He said, suddenly rubbing the sleep from his eyes. A good memory? She asked him, confused, and Luffy gave a small laugh. Shishishi, I hope we find a waterfall. He said, and Nami shook her head. I hope not. This little boat isn't strong enough to survive one, and you can't swim. She said as Zoro opened one of his eyes, listening to the two. Not to go down, but to splash in. He said, and Nami realized he meant just a small waterfall on an island. I guess that would be alright. She said, and thought as Luffy looked up at the clouds. You never know what treasure you'll find at a waterfall. He whispered, and Zoro smiled, closing his eye. Luffy was missing his family at this moment, but he knew the next time he saw his pops, he'd have more treasure to give him than just a small rock. He'd have all his nakama, the greatest treasure of all. After spending time with Kaya, Nami had come to a nice conclusion. She liked the girl. Kaya was open-hearted and truly intelligent, which made Nami smile, a true smile for the girl. She listened to Kaya's tale about her parents' death and felt her heart go out for the girl. She also took in how Usopp had been coming over ever since it happened and trying his hardest to cheer her up with his wild stories. I know all Usopp told me was lies, but Kaya felt tears forming in her eyes, thinking about how harsh Usopp had been laying like that about her butler. People do crazy things to protect the ones they love. Nami said, her eyes distant, thinking of the things she had done. I just wish she would be honest with me, Kaya said, taking a sip of her tea, looking down to the ground. Nami knew her job here was to keep Kaya away from as much trouble as possible, but she had decided that before Usopp went off with Luffy on his little adventure, she'd make sure they set things all straight. When we get the chance, I think we should talk more with him, alright? Nami asked, picking her teacup up and sipping it. You're right, Nami, I'm glad we're talking. Kaya smiled, happy to have time with another girl for once. I am too, Nami replied, hoping everything went alright with Luffy on his end. How long are you both going to sleep? Usopp asked, while Luffy and Zoro, who were both snoring away under a tree, as if a crazy pirate crew wasn't making their way towards the island this very moment. It's not like I have to really fight hard, and if those guys know what's good for them, they won't actually want to fight me. Luffy shrugged, opening one eye, and looked at Usopp, who had his jaw slack slightly. Because you're strong? He asked once he pulled himself together. Nope, because Marco will probably find out some way or another, and they won't like what he might do to them. Luffy laughed, imagining his maw all fired up, his blue eyes glaring down anyone who so much as touched Luffy. I keep forgetting there are people out there watching your back that are a lot stronger than you. Usopp said, rubbing his forehead with his thumb, sighing. Shishishi, Pops will help if I need it, but I don't want to have them protect me anymore. It's time that I started to get strong for myself and my crew. Luffy said, looking at Usopp while Zoro continued to sleep, but Luffy sensed that he was actually paying attention. "You have one super cool family," Luffy Usopp muttered, turning to look at the water, knowing that soon a bunch of pirates would be here. "You do, to Usopp, your dad is pretty awesome," Luffy exclaimed happily, and Usopp blushed before rubbing his nose. "Yeah, I guess so, I must get my amazingness from my old man." Usopp then took a pose, but Luffy just laughed it off before leaning back on the tree and closing his eyes again. "The party should be here soon, so rest while you can," Luffy encouraged, but Usopp shook his head. "I'm alright, I'll keep watch for now." He then climbed the tree and kept his eyes out on the open waters. "Suit yourself." Luffy shrugged before falling asleep once again. "I'll protect this village if it's the last thing I do," Usopp muttered to himself as snoring began once again, indicating that Luffy had fallen back to sleep. When Kaya fell asleep, Nami opened her eyes, sitting up slowly not to alert the girl she was moving. "Luffy and Usopp say your butler is untrustworthy, so I'm to guard you just in case," Nami whispered, taking a seat by the door so she could listen to any movement in the dark house. Being a thief, and a really damn good one, Nami had learned to use observational skills to see her surroundings to help protect herself better. Never once in her lifetime though did she ever think she'd use those skills to help another person. "The pirate wants me to protect someone that has nothing really to do with his goal. What a weird man you are, Luffy." Nami couldn't help but smile, because out of all the pirates she had met, Luffy just appeared so different. It could be the fact that he was so open and honest about what he was feeling and thinking. He didn't have any hidden agenda or secrets, so she couldn't help but trust him. Placing her hand over the covered tattoo on her shoulder, she thought about what was happening back home. "If only all pirates could be like you, Luffy," she said sadly before looking up, startled because of a loud sound happening down the stairs. She could wake Kaya, but first it was time to check things out carefully, of course. There was no way Nami wanted to fight whoever was causing trouble in the house. She was just on guard duty. Luffy was the one to kick people's asses. Listening harder, Nami could hear someone coming up the stairs, so she hid as best as she could in Kaya's closet. Hopefully whoever it was didn't see her, and even more so wasn't strong enough to sense her like Luffy could. When the door opened, it was the butler Usopp had told them about. Nami had to place a hand over her mouth to stop herself from shouting or even from breathing too hard. She watched through the small crack in the closet as he walked over to Kaya and placed his bladed hands close to her throat. Nami felt herself beginning to shake, so she stepped away from the wooden doors so she didn't make any sounds. She knew it was her job to protect Kaya, and leaving the girl to die would be letting Luffy and the others down. Nami was now mentally preparing herself to jump out from the closet and try and fight off the man, but heard his footsteps as he left the room, leaving the door open. Nami looked over at Kaya's sleeping form and sighed, knowing things were going to go bad for the kind girl. "Sorry Kaya, I need to go now. Luffy is strong, but I want to be there to help where I can." Then she opened the window and jumped out, rushing to the place she knew Luffy and the others were hopefully waiting. Usopp kept his eyes on the sea when his spyglass spotted a ship hiding off close to the island. "They're here," he whispered, panic searing through his veins. "Luffy, I spot a ship," Usopp yelled down to his friends who were now stretching and yawning. "About time, I thought they'd never get here." Luffy yawned and Usopp scowled, a tick on his forehead. "We don't want pirates on this island, stupid," he shouted at Luffy, who just gave a small special laugh to his tone. "But I'm a pirate, you don't want me here?" Luffy asked, which just caused Usopp to sweat drop at Luffy and his logic. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Usopp snapped. Worry was getting the better of him now. "Let them come, I'll take them all on myself." Zoro yawned, standing up and watching as the sun was coming up on the horizon now. "Luffy." Nami had raced from Kaya's house all the way to the cliff where she knew everyone would be. "What are you doing here? Where's Kaya?" Usopp asked, even more worried now. "She's sleeping. The butler guy did something in the house." Usopp just stared at Nami. "Then why are you here? You should be protecting her." He didn't like the idea of Kaya being all alone in the house by herself. "She'll be fine as long as we do our job here." Luffy sat up fully now, his eyes on the ship that was sailing ever closer to the island. "I'm not going to completely fight, I want to see how strong all of you have gotten since we last met." Luffy knew that should he need to, he was to step in and end the fight altogether, but why get in the way of some needed training? "But I don't want to fight all those pirates." Nami freaked out and Usopp nodded, panicking hard. "Usopp, Nami, if you guys can't handle these guys, you'll never survive in the Grand Line." He needed to make it clear to them that the Grand Line and New World were no joke. Here you can make mistakes, but their one mistake could mean your life. Zoro was stunned by Luffy's behavior. Normally Luffy was laid back and laughter, but here he was acting more serious and even finally taking on the role of captain. "So all we need to do is kick these guys' asses?" he asked Luffy, and the straw-hatted captain nodded, crossing his arms looking at Zoro, who was now tying his bandana on his head ready for battle. "Should be pretty easy for you." Luffy smirked, looking up at Zoro, a sense of pride going between them because Luffy knew Zoro would never lose and Luffy would never let anyone touch his nakama so long as he lived. "They're here," Nami whispered as pirates were beginning to jump to the shore from their ship. "So it's time to begin, is it?" The sun was up and the battle ready to begin. "Luffy, you wait here, this will be over quickly." Zoro had touched the hilt of his blade, smirking down the hill at the pirate crew. "Right then, we can go get Sanji." None of the people around Luffy knew who this Sanji guy was, but if Luffy had said his name, it meant he was one of them whether he liked it or not. Walking into the group of pirates, Zoro placed one of his swords into his mouth, clutching the hilt tightly with his teeth. Pulling his other blades out, he glared at the pirates before using all three swords in perfect unison, slicing them before they even made it up the hill. "He's so strong." Usopp stuttered out as Luffy plopped himself down at the top of the hill. "He's been training just like we have been, Usopp. Zoro's going to need you to watch his back as he deals with all those in front of him," Luffy said, but his eyes never left Zoro as he continued to butcher the weaklings one by one. "Right." Putting his goggles over his eyes, Usopp got his slingshot ready to attack should any poor sucker sneak past the swordsman. "I'm going to rob that ship," Nami stated, knowing that it was probably filled with treasures. "Sure." Luffy was too preoccupied with the small fight happening in front of him to really listen right now. Nami, being a capable thief, knew how to sneak around dangerous situations, even some like this one right now. She carefully snuck by the pirates, catching Zoro's eye for a moment as he blocked another blade before breaking the weak metal under the pressure of his own strong ones. "Luffy, I'm getting bored," Zoro complained up at Luffy, who laughed. "Shishishi. The sun glows in the sky, Captain Kuro isn't a patient man," one of the guys said before looking around and yelling at his beaten men on the ground. Zoro turned back to see them starting to get up and gave them an almost bored expression. "So you want to be beaten down again?" He scoffed at them as the leader of the group pulled out some circled knives dangling from his strong and swaying them back and forth. "What are they doing down there?" Luffy stood up to take a better look and the sun caught off the circle blade, catching Luffy's attention. "Shiny," he muttered, looking closer, watching the blade swing back and forth as the man said something, and Luffy's mind went blank, rage filling his very being. "Luffy?" Usopp asked, watching as Luffy began to growl like an animal before charging down the hill, his fists blackened with haki. "What?" Zoro asked as Luffy ran right into the pile of growling pirates, knocking them all down and even causing some to lose their anger and run back away from the boy. "Where do you think you're going?" The hypno guy freaked as a few of his crewmates ran past him in fear. Luffy, growling, ran towards the leader, who cowered in fear that the boy was going to send him flying as well, but Luffy just ran past him and attacked the ship like it was nothing. "Why is he attacking the ship?" the man yelled, which caused Zoro to have enough. Walking towards his rampaging captain, who was using enough haki to cause a few of the weaker pirates to faint, Zoro was going to stop Luffy from making his job harder. "Kill them, Meow Bond brothers," the leader shouted, but Zoro was so angry to even pay any attention to them. Continuing his walk towards Luffy, the brothers moved to attack Zoro from the air. "Don't you dare even think about it," Usopp shouted, pulling his slingshot back and shooting the brothers from the sky. "I'm the greatest sniper on Luffy's crew, so it's my job to have their backs." Usopp glared at the brothers as they moved away from Zoro and decided to fight against Usopp, who kept stepping back. A sniper doesn't have to fight on the front lines as long as he's got his captain's back. Usopp had never felt this brave before, but now he knew nothing would stop him. Zoro walked right up to Luffy, who was punching into the ship, causing small fist-shaped dents into the wood. Closing his eyes, Zoro put his blades back into their proper sheaths before punching Luffy on the head, not knowing that his fingers up to his knuckles had turned black with haki. "That hurt," Luffy shouted, grabbing his head before blinking his eyes, confused as to why he was at the bottom of the hill. "You tell us to handle these pirates ourselves, then run down the hill like a maniac," Zoro yelled at Luffy, who was rubbing the back of his head, apologizing. "How'd this ship get so many holes in it? Don't these guys know that ships sink that way?" Luffy asked, examining the broken parts of the ship he was standing by, only for a few tick marks to appear on Zoro's head. "You caused that damage, idiot. I thought I was going to die in there." Nami had come out of the ship just to punch Luffy in the back of the head for his reckless actions. Sorry. Luffy once again apologized. Usopp was feeling quite proud of himself, being able to take on two opponents at once with a relative ease, it seemed. "Why don't you let us see your little toy, one of the brothers called to Usopp, reaching for his weapon with one of their clawed hands. "No thanks." Moving his hands quickly, Usopp put in a new bit of ammunition to use and try out. "Firebird star," Usopp shouted, letting the flaming attack fly and hit one of the brothers, burning him enough for Usopp to climb into a tree. "I'll use the leaves as cover for me," he whispered to himself. "Even if they block my vision slightly, Luffy is counting on me to win, so I will." He knew one of the brothers was down burned, so hopefully he wouldn't be getting back up so quickly. Here goes nothing. Yusuf then pulled his slingshot back and shot at the other brother, trying to get him to lose his footing. You can't hide from me. The man yelled at the sniper before realizing Yusuf was in a tree, so he climbed it like a cat would to reach the boy, but Yusuf could see his plan right before he did it. I'm faster than that guy since I'm smaller. Climbing swiftly through the branches, but still aiming at the guy was hard, but Yusuf could do it. He doesn't get it, his stupid cowbell gives away his position every time. Yusuf laughed quietly to himself as the man once again was hit by one of Yusuf's attacks. For some reason or another Yusuf felt like he could see each movement the man was making before he even made it. I only had one WhiteBeard, but my normal ammo isn't going to cut it. He knew the sniper was only as good as the weapon he used, and being around Luffy long enough taught him that it was okay to need help. Looking around for anyone to help him as he moved through the trees, his eyes spotted Zoro, who was knocking a few more people off their feet while Luffy was protecting Nami and her treasure. Pulling his slingshot back, he aimed it at Zoro's feet to get the swordsman's attention, which worked quite easily. Zoro, can you deal with these guys? The swordsman was wondering why Yusuf was in a tree in the first place and not on the ground, but decided not to question him as Luffy laughed. Yusuf, you look like a monkey in that tree. He chuckled and pointed. I work better from afar. He shouted in Luffy's direction, which only caused the captain to laugh a bit more. I'm not monsters like you guys, I've still got lots more training to do before I can match up to you. Yusuf shouted at them as Zoro moved in to finish off the brothers. What's taking you so long? Luffy turned his head towards the bottom of the beach, where the main jerk had just arrived. We ran into some difficulties, Captain Kuro. The hypno guy said to him, and the man carefully pushed his glasses up his nose. I should have known that leaving this task to you was too much to ask for. He spat out at the man before turning his eyes to Yusuf and smirking. Good job trying to warn the villagers, you made yourself look like a complete fool. Kuro mocked Yusuf, who was gritting his teeth at the sight of that man. What have you done to Kaya? Yusuf spoke through his teeth, glaring at the butler. Nothing yet. He smirked, causing Luffy's eyes to narrow. Luffy wasn't one to interfere with another's battle, but this guy was pissing him off and he hadn't done much yet. So you're the captain? Luffy asked in an emotionless voice, causing the man to turn his eyes away from Yusuf and onto Luffy, who was still sitting in the dirt. And who might you be, little boy? The affairs of this village and all in it have nothing to do with you. He said back to Luffy, how shook his head at the man, as if calling him stupid. I'm Luffy and anything my crew decides to protect means I'll protect it as well. Luffy shrugged, causing the butler to laugh at him. Well, you are doing a poor job of protecting anything just sitting there. Can you really do anything at all? He asked Luffy, who just smirked, his hat shadowing his eyes slightly now. I don't need to move right now, there's no need. And can I do anything? Well, I can kick your ass if I need to, but I did think Yusuf might want to crack at you first. He said as Kuro laughed loudly at his threat. Yusuf? You mean that weakling and liar? Luffy really didn't like him, but honestly he had seen much worse people in the world to be fazed by much. He may be weak. Luffy started. Oi. Yusuf cut in, but he's a lot more of a man than you'll ever be, butler guy. Luffy said simply, but the man just turned away from him. It doesn't matter either way, you'll all be dead shortly. Yusuf and his pirate blood is reason enough for him to never have been born. Kuro said before turning and shouting at his men who were cowering as Zoro finished off the brothers easily. Luffy stood up silently, he was finished playing around now. Yusuf? All but Luffy turned around to see Kaya standing by the trees, her face pale and eyes sad. Kaya, what are you doing here? Yusuf jumped down from the tree and ran towards her, wanting to push her as far away from this place as possible. I came to say I'm sorry. I was wrong. Kaya had stumbled upon another of her house servants, Mary, and heard the truth from him what had happened. Kaya, this place isn't safe for a lady such as you. Kuro said to her, taking back on his butler formalities. Plahater, why? If you want my fortune, my mansion, you can have it, but please, don't hurt anyone else. She cried to the man. Oh, but I have to, Miss Kaya. He said before beginning to talk about why he was running from the sea. I don't care. Luffy said, crossing his arms. Zoro gave Luffy a look, wondering what he was up to. What did you say to me, brat? Kuro snarled, so Luffy repeated himself. I don't care. I don't care about your backstory and why you hate the sea. I don't care about what you want with that girl's life, I really don't care about all that at all. What I do care about is that you mocked and harmed my friends, and for that I'm going to kick your ass. Luffy said before turning to look at Zoro, who was still looking at Luffy waiting for orders. All Luffy did was nod in Yusuf's direction, and Zoro grinned. I got it, Captain. He said before turning and moving to guard the girl. Yusuf, we're to protect this lady here. He said, giving Yusuf Luffy's orders. But shouldn't we be fighting Kuro? Yusuf was confused. Luffy hadn't spoken any words to the swordsman at all. No need, this battle will be over soon. Zoro closed his eyes and could feel the anger coming off of Luffy. That man was about to get what was coming to him. "So you wish to fight me, little boy?" Kuro mocked before beginning to sway back and forth weirdly. "Fine, I'll just have to kill you myself then." He then moved really quickly, slicing everyone and everything in his path. Luffy was watching the butler guy, and the way he harmed the people who followed him pissed him off more. Winding back his fist, he aimed it towards the butler, hitting him easily. "But how?" Kuro exclaimed, touching his face where Luffy had hit him. "I'm not like you," Luffy whispered angrily. "That's right, you're weak compared to me. You could never be half the man I am," Kuro said before stepping back into his attack, causing his men to scream in terror at the thought of being killed by their captain. "All that running around is really annoying," Luffy shouted before grabbing the guy by his shirt, holding him still long enough for Luffy to get a good punch into the man's face. "But that's impossible," he cried out. "I'm Captain Kuro, the man of 1,000 plans," he declared. "I will not be defeated by a no-name pirate on these seas." He pointed at Luffy once he had got his footing back. "I'm not some no-name pirate. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, the man who will become the king of the pirates," he shouted, glaring at the butler. "No one's ever been able to even touch Captain Kuro before. How could this even be happening?" The hypno guy cried out in fear, and Zoro smirked down at Luffy. "What good is speed when your opponent can see your every move?" Zoro said softly, knowing that Luffy's observation skills were too good to even let him get a scratch from that guy. "But no one is faster than our captain," one person shouted out before being taunted by said captain. "You all had pretty bad luck running into Luffy." Zoro couldn't stop the excited feeling in his chest, knowing Luffy was stronger than most people. "That's right, Luffy isn't just anyone. He's the son of WhiteBeard." Usopp smiled, his slingshot still pointed at anyone who dared move near Kaya, especially the hypno guy. "The WhiteBeard pirate? Don't make me laugh. People like them never come to the East Blue," Kuro said, not believing that Luffy was really anything other than a new rookie on the seas. "You're right, I'm not a WhiteBeard pirate, I'm my own captain now and don't need my pops to take care of me anymore," Luffy said to Kuro, who stopped smiling. "The WhiteBeard pirate, but that's impossible," Nami whispered, her eyes wide, really looking at Luffy now, trying to see the title beyond the carefree boy in front of her. "Like I said, pops is pops and I'm me, we're totally different crews now." Luffy was starting to get annoyed, knowing that this reaction might happen a lot by people. "We can't touch him. If we do, that old man will kill us all." A few weaklings called out to Kuro, who turned towards them and snarled. "Weak people like all of you should just die then if you aren't here to fight." Kuro then went back into his attack, moving quickly, slicing many of his nakama along the way. "You know, being from a large family, I hate people like you. People who misuse their crew, their nakama, their own family, don't deserve to be commanded like dogs." Luffy growled, stretching his arm out and grabbing Kuro by the leg, dragging him back towards Luffy around the fallen and dead pirates. "Do you think you can defeat me, boy?" Kuro shouted as Luffy then stretched his neck far back while holding Kuro by the shoulders. "Of course." Luffy then coated his forehead with haki before shouting his attack. "Gomu Gomu no Bell." Letting his neck snap back forward, he hit Kuro in the head. A loud ding could be heard from the move, but Kuro fell to the ground, completely unconscious, blood trickling down his forehead by the force of Luffy's head-on attack. Feeling slightly dizzy by the action, he tried to regain himself before pulling Kuro up by the shirt and throwing him to his old crew. "Take this man back with you, back to the sea he so hates, and never return to this island." Luffy looked up at them, his eyes dark and angry as the men nodded, sweating bullets before rushing back to their broken ship and setting sail away from the island. The dizziness setting in fully now, Luffy stumbled upon his feet as Nami caught him before he fell. "Luffy, why did you get so upset at them?" She needed to know, especially if Luffy had always been a pirate. "Because they're wrong, Nakama family shouldn't be treated like that ever." She helped steady him before smiling softly but sadly. "Not every pirate thinks like you do." She truly believed in Luffy now, even if what Usopp said was true about his family, Luffy was still Luffy. "I'm hungry," Luffy whined, closing his eyes before falling on his back in the sand. "We did it," Usopp cried out happily before giving Kaya a hug in excitement. Kaya was laughing softly at Usopp as he blushed embarrassedly after letting her go. "Thank you, all of you, for saving me and this village," she said, walking towards Luffy and bowing deeply to him, but he just laughed it off. "It was Usopp and his courage that made us want to help out," Luffy said truthfully. "And I got a lot of treasure out of it." Nami winked to Kaya, who smiled at her friend. "But we still don't have a ship, guys," Zoro reminded them, and Nami sighed, remembering their small problem. "You need a ship?" she asked, confused. "Yeah, that's what we came to ask you for last time," Luffy said, leaning on his elbows in the sand, looking up at the girl. "I'm not sure what I can do, but please let me try." She smiled to Luffy, who cheered at her, happy and tired, but more importantly he was hungry. Yusuf food now, Luffy whined once again before falling back to the beach sand and holding his stomach, his tongue falling from his mouth to emphasize just how hungry he was. Alright, let's go eat. The small band of pirates were tired and hungry, especially Luffy, but it finally seemed things were looking up for them. Whoa. This is so cool. Luffy shouted, looking at the shiny brand new ship before them. Wow, that's a Caravel class. Nami said, happy to see such a beautiful ship. Mary here designed it. Kaya said happily, her hands folded in front of her. It's an older model, but still a dream ship I like to call the Going Merry. He said happily to talk about it. Usopp was standing beside Luffy, his backpack filled with everything he would need for the journey out at sea. It's going to be lonesome without your stories, Usopp. Kaya said as Luffy and the others jumped aboard to check out the new ship, Mary following behind to talk about each place. The next time we meet I'll have real stories to tell you, so don't stay sick, alright? He asked her and she nodded. I as well will be different the next time we meet. She was planning to start studying to become a doctor. Boy Usopp, hurry up. Luffy yelled, leaning over the railing to yell at his sniper. Impatient as ever, I guess I'll see you around. Usopp waved before jumping to the ship as well. Goodbye everyone. Kaya and Mary called, waving as the Mary sailed away from the island. Nami watched as Luffy finished waving goodbye before approaching Luffy. Is what Usopp said true? Are you really a Whitebeard pirate? Nami wasn't stupid, she knew of the big names in the pirating world. I grew up with Pops and the others, so I guess I was part of that crew, but I'm not now. They're still my family and I love them a lot, but I want to be strong on my own. He shrugged, not understanding why it was such a big deal to everyone. Why didn't you tell me this when we met? She knew fully if he had she would never have joined him, or maybe she would have, but it doesn't really matter anymore. Because it's not a big deal. Pops and the others won't get in our way of having an adventure. Luffy pouted, annoyed that his Pop's name was already starting to stick to him. Nami, me and Pops is Pops, just like I said to that butler jerk, so let's have fun, alright? Luffy gave Nami one of his trademark grins before running off to find Usopp to get the flag designed. Nami watched him leave before sighing and putting her hand over her covered tattoo. Would you like these guys? Bellemere. Meanwhile, a flirty cook was serving a sweet treat to a beautiful lady at a restaurant not far off. Looking at the waves through one of the windows in the dining room, he couldn't help feel like something was about to happen. Sanji, stop dawdling around and serve those people their drinks already. The head chef shouted at the teenager, who glared at him before passing out the waters to the table of only men, ignoring them as he walked back away. That boy should be back soon, Zeph said to Sanji, who looked confused for a moment before the memory of a loud straw-hatted kid came to mind. Better let the cooks know he'll be back so they can prepare for his stomach. Sanji sighed, rubbing his head, but really he was excited to see the boy again. Looking back out the window, that strange feeling was returning once more. Taking a deep inhale of his cigarette and blowing out the smoke, he smiled. What trouble are you bringing with you this time, Luffy? Usopp. Luffy called from the figurehead where he had decided to make this his special spot. You don't need to scream, Luffy, seriously. Usopp scolded his captain and friend, who just laughed happily. I drew our pirate flag, want to see it? He asked excitedly, pulling his artwork up and showing his small crew what he had decided would represent their pirate crew. Is it an abstract art, maybe? Nami asked, tilting her head and squinting her eyes, trying to decide if she liked it or not. Well, a pirate crew's mark is supposed to strike fear into people's hearts, and that does a pretty good job. Zoro was just a step away from approving the flag until Usopp stepped in to save the day and his crew's reputation. Nope, sorry Luffy, but really you should have asked a real professional artist to make the flag. Usopp sighed before taking new fresh black cloth that Kaya had supplied onto the ship for them and recreating a new flag with a mixture of his sniper qualities and Luffy's straw hat. Usopp, wanting to be a little sneaky, he put a touch of himself in. See, doesn't this look better? He asked, knowing full well Luffy was about to deny it. Not at all, stop joking around. Luffy scowled and Usopp chuckled, happy to have pulled a prank on his captain. Nami couldn't stop herself from laughing at the flag that had been created, which in turn caused the entire of them to laugh along with her. Make us the proper one now. Luffy said, wiping a few stray tears away from his eyes and grinning as Usopp nodded, a serious look on his face, but still he smiled. Once the new and proper flag was created, Usopp was ordered to paint the sails with the same mark, while Nami and Luffy helped prepare the drinks for a party to celebrate that afternoon. Luffy was curious and, never being one to let things go, couldn't stop wondering when Nami was going to do something he wouldn't like. He didn't want to ask her what was wrong, since he did feel it wasn't much his business, but at the same time, as one of his nakama, it was now becoming his business. The mental dilemma continued on in his head on whether he should ask her about what was wrong or not before she turned to look at him, pulling a few glasses down from the cupboard. Luffy, do you have a mother? Nami asked him, leaning against the counter and looking at him carefully. Well kinda, he said, knowing Marco wasn't probably the mother she was thinking of. What do you mean by that? My mother I guess is Marco, he raised me from birth and has always been there for me no matter what, so I guess he's my mother and I do call him Ma. Luffy chuckled at the end, really thinking about his ma. Wouldn't that make him your father then? Hearing that his ma was actually a man. Nope, Pops is my father. He said that simply because that was the truth. So you never met your birth mother? Luffy was confused on why this was a big deal. The people that raised him loved him a lot, so did it matter whose blood was really in his veins? Nope, but I don't really care about that. All I know is that my birth dad gave me to Pops and Marco and they have loved me like their son my entire life. Why should I be interested in the people who didn't want me? He didn't know for certain if his birth parents did or didn't want him. All he cared about was that he was raised by his family and nothing could ever change that. Nami, family is family, it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. Luffy said to her, pouring some juice into the glasses. He and Nami walked out the door with glasses of juice in their hands. If you need our help, all you need to do is ask. Leaving it at that for Nami to think about, Luffy left the galley. Walking towards Zoro, Luffy passed him his drink only for the man to frown at it. Juice? He asked Luffy, staring down at the liquid. I don't like alcohol much. He shrugged, leaving Zoro with a drink as Usopp climbed down from the sails panting and covered in paint. There. Usopp said proudly as Nami gave him a drink and smiled. Thanks for your hard work. She greeted him and he smiled sheepishly at her gratefully. It was nothing for an experienced painter like myself, I've been doing this for nearly 50 years you know. He said, sitting on the deck taking the drink and cooling off. 50 years, really? Nami asked in sarcasm, catching his lie easily. How many grandchildren do you have, Usopp? Zoro snickered at the sniper who was beginning to blush. Wow, you must be as old as my pops. Luffy joined in, causing the teenager to shake his head and drink his juice back quickly, avoiding the laughter coming from his joking crewmates. To the going merry. Luffy shouted, raising his glass to his new ship along with everyone else. The day passed by smoothly, filled with laughter and exploration of their new home, when Usopp heard Luffy making loud noises on deck, waking him from his nap. What are you doing, Luffy? He had fallen asleep after the party from exhaustion due to painting the sails in the hot afternoon sun. Trying out the cannon. His siblings never let him near anything that could earn the first commander's wrath, so using the cannons back home was something he never got to do. Let an old pro show you how it's done. Usopp joked, pushing Luffy aside, stuffing the cannon with the proper things and lighting it, allowing it to go off and hit a giant rock far off into the distance. Amazing. You hit it. Luffy yelled, jumping up and down excitedly. I did, of course I did. I'm the great and amazing Usopp-sama. Usopp threw back his shoulders, making himself stand taller in pride. Before the two could celebrate properly, a small boat was being rowed towards them at top speed. Come out, pirates. A voice shouted as a man jumped aboard the ship and sliced the railing up. Stop hurting our ship. Luffy screamed at him, but the man was too angry to listen. I've killed hundreds of pirates like you all, so how dare you kill my friend? He cried out and sliced another railing up, causing Luffy to have enough and punched the guy down to stop him. I said stop hurting our new ship, we don't know anything about your friend. Luffy shouted at the man loudly, waking Zoro up from one of his many naps. What's going on now, Luffy? Zoro yawned, walking towards the deck, his eyes opened wide when he saw who was on the floor. Johnny, is that you? Zoro asked, taking a good look at the man who glared at the pirates. Who dares speak my name so casually? He growled out, but smiled once he realized who it was that was talking to him. Big brother Zoro. He shouted in happiness, which brought confusion to Luffy on who this guy was. So it is you? Where's Yusaku? Don't you guys travel together? Zoro looked around for the other man he was friends with but didn't see him, which was weird. Yusaku, he's sick. He was fine until a few days ago and now he's dying, big bro. Johnny cried out and Zoro couldn't help but feel bad for his friends. You know these guys, Zoro? Luffy asked, still confused. Yeah, I traveled with them for a while when I was looking for you. Zoro said, offhandedly, going and checking on Yusaku to see how the guy was with his own eyes. You were the guy big bro was looking for? Johnny asked Luffy, looking up at the Straw Hat Captain. Well, he was supposed to be waiting for me, but yeah, I guess I am. Luffy shrugged, following Zoro and looking at the sick friend. Maybe if you feed him some meat he might get better. Luffy suggested, only for Usopp to slap him over the head. That doesn't work on people, Luffy. He shouted. We were resting on that rock island over there when a cannon was shot at us. Johnny said, hiding his eyes with his sleeve as he cried. Ah, we're so sorry. Luffy and Usopp said at the same time, bowing their heads in shame, causing Johnny to shout at them some more. Nami rolled her eyes at the scene before walking towards them, her hand on her hip to take a good look at the guy. From the looks of it, he has scurvy. Luffy, Usopp, there are some lemons in the storage room, right? Go grab some for me. she commanded, and the two boys were up and moving following her order. Once they returned with piles of fresh lemons in their hands, Nami rolled her eyes, taking only one of them, cutting it in half and squeezing the juice into the man's mouth. Suddenly the man jumped back to life like nothing had happened. "Isaku, you're alive," Johnny yelled, and the two hugged, laughing and even crying. "You're lucky you're alive, you had scurvy and by the looks of things you only had a few days left at most," she scolded the man, who then grabbed hold of her hand and thanked her profusely. "Wow, Nami, you're like a doctor," Luffy said in awe, looking at his navigator. "Every person who sails these seas should know about this, Luffy, it can happen to you if you don't come prepared," she scolded, but Zoro nodded to her, grateful that she was able to help save his friend. "You're right, what we need is a sea chef then to help balance our food properly so we don't all get sick," Usopp said in thought. "Well, if you guys are looking for a chef, we know a place," Johnny said to the crew, but Luffy brushed it off. "Nah, we got a chef already," he said, only for Nami to smack him behind the head. "Where were you guys thinking about?" she asked them, and Johnny smiled. "The Barati. It's got the best chefs around." Luffy, hearing those words, grinned like an idiot. "It does, doesn't it? Sanji will be waiting for us there," Luffy said to them, which brought about a bit of confusion. "Sanji?" Zoro asked, but Luffy turned to Nami. "Remember the place you brought me to when I went missing a few years ago?" he asked her, causing her to blink in confusion, thinking back that far. "You mean that giant floating fish place?" she said, placing a hand under her chin, thinking carefully. "Yeah, that place. We have a chef waiting for us there, but he doesn't know it yet," Luffy thought out loud. "That's the Barati. If you're already heading in that direction, please allow us to take you there," they said, jumping up, happy to be useful, only for Yusaku to fall back down tired and sick. "Yusaku?" Johnny shouted, only for Nami to scold them for thinking he would be healed right away. "So we're finally coming for you, Sanji." Luffy grinned. Zoro couldn't stop the feeling of annoyance at the thought of this new crewmate, even if he hadn't met him yet. They sailed for a long while, allowing Zoro and his friends to catch up on the stuff that had happened to them since they had been split. "So that's the captain you were looking for, Zoro bro?" Johnny asked as his friend Yusaku got some needed sleep. "Yeah, he's a real pain in the ass, but he's the man I chose to follow," Zoro said fondly as Luffy lay on his back on top of the figurehead, looking at the clouds going by. "He's rather strange." Johnny wasn't as strong as Zoro, but even he could feel that the boy with the straw hat was stronger than he appeared to be. "Luffy doesn't need to act strong to be strong." Zoro couldn't believe those words had come from him, but being with Luffy, he learned some new things. While he himself gave the appearance of strength and caution, Luffy always seemed to have that air of childishness, appearing like a kid in way over his head. As great as it was to have people fear him at sight, Luffy's childishness worked in his favor most times. Most people didn't take Luffy seriously until it was too late, but for him they took him seriously each and every time. "If you will follow him, then he must be a good guy." Johnny smiled as Luffy began to cry out for food. "I'll make you something, for a price of course." Nami smiled and Zoro closed his eyes in annoyance. "With rates like yours we'll starve, witch." Zoro growled at her and she just laughed at him. "Why not make it yourself then, Captain?" she asked Luffy, who scowled at the water. "Last time I tried to help in the kitchen I burned down the baker's table. My brother Thatch refused to let me back in there for a month after that, and even then I had to beg Marco to talk him into forgiving me." Zoro couldn't stop the laugh at a clumsy Luffy burning things down around him. "Figures," Usopp said, shaking his head as Luffy pouted at their teasing. "How much longer until we get there?" He whined some more as Yusaku woke up and came to join the crew on deck. "Should be shortly, see over there?" Johnny pointed in the distance where a large ship was floating. "That's the place," he said with a smile. "Yosh." Luffy jumped in excitement at the idea of getting some of Sanji's amazing food once again. Sailing closer to the floating restaurant, excitement was in the air at getting a good meal, and for Luffy, seeing his good friend. All excitement drained when a marine vessel showed up in front of them, blocking their path. "Pirates?" a man with pink hair asked, looking down at the annoyed and even scared faces on the Going Merry. "Boy, can you move your ship, it's in the way," Luffy called at the man, who laughed. "The pirate telling me, a marine lieutenant, Iron Fist full body, what to do? I've never seen your mark before, pirate," he scoffed, looking down his nose at Luffy. "Yeah, we just made it today," Luffy said simply to the man, who turned to look at Johnny and Yusaku, who were cowering on deck. "So it seems you finally caught yourselves some actual pirates," he said to them, and they growled at the marine. "Orders, sir?" a grunt asked, and the man smirked. "Sink it." He then turned away from them, moving towards his date, leaving the pirates to their fate as a cannon was shot at the Mary. Taking action, Luffy blew himself up and bounced a cannonball away from the ship. Unfortunately, Luffy's foot got caught on the railing of the Mary and he stumbled, shooting the cannon into the restaurant. "We're in big trouble now," Nami said, and Luffy fell back on the deck, closing his eyes. Sanji's gonna kill me. He sighed. Accepting his fate, Luffy and the crew all moved into the restaurant to talk. I gotta go find that old man and apologize. Luffy said to his crew, who nodded, knowing Luffy's nature of honesty. Smiling softly at the memories of this place, Luffy walked up the stairs looking for Zeph and hopefully the stray shot. So it was you, brat, what are you doing shooting at us? Zeph the owner looked down at Luffy, who was still climbing the stairs. It was an accident. He smiled and Zeph shook his head. That accident of yours will cost you. Zeph moved to let Luffy past him and they walked towards an old room Luffy had stayed in once before. I'm kinda poor right now, can I pay you back later? Luffy asked Zeph, who crossed his arms and pointed to the hole in his roof. Why don't you work the payment off then? Zeph asked him with a smirk and Luffy scowled. No way. I'm not asking for much time, just a year. Zeph said and Luffy glared. If this is Ma's way of keeping an eye on me by making me stay in one spot, I'll be mad. Luffy said slowly to the old chef, who didn't say anything, just smiled. I'll be sending the bill to your pops. He challenged, knowing that Luffy didn't want his family's help. Tell pops I say hi. Luffy grinned. It was quiet for a second before they both burst out in laughter. I want you to do that yourself, brat. Zeph then walked to a desk, opened it up and pulled out a transponder snail. You should have one of these. He hadn't brought one with him when he left since he wanted to have his own adventures. You're lucky to have a family that cares, kid, don't worry them too much. Zeph left the room with Luffy sitting there staring at the phone. He did miss his family really. But he wanted to talk to them when he was back in home waters. Looks like that old man's not leaving me any choice, is he? Luffy sighed, picking up the receiver and smiling softly to himself. Hello? The smooth voice of Thatch made him smile wider. Is that all you have to say after so long? Luffy asked, his voice a bit shaky, but it was from excitement more than emotion. There was a pause on the other end as the snail's eyes widened at recognizing Luffy's voice. Blue? Thatch asked just to be sure and Luffy gave his signature laugh. Shishishi, where's Ma? Luffy asked his brother, who laughed. What, am I not good enough, brat? Thatch joked and Luffy gave a faint pout. Of course you are, I just need to talk to him, that's all. There was a shuffling around on the other end, so Luffy knew Thatch was rushing to find Marco and anyone else who wanted to talk to him. You didn't bring a snail with you, Yoi? Were Marco's first words and he sounded slightly offended. I forgot. Luffy said before laughing at the annoyed Marco. Where are you and how did you come by one of these? Thatch asked, pushing Marco aside. I'm at the Barady, I may have blown a hole through their roof, Luffy giggled and Marco sighed. So Zeph gave you this, did he, Yoi? Marco asked and Luffy looked confused. Didn't you give it to him to give to me? Luffy thought for sure this was Marco's idea to keep an eye on him. Have you forgotten that there is one other person who might be very protective of you, Lu? A voice that Luffy had missed the most asked him through the phone and he couldn't help but grin a toothy smile. Ace? Ace chuckled, pushing both Thatch and Marco away from the phone. I think I left that there when we visited a few years ago. Ace admitted to Luffy, who nodded. So Marco wasn't trying to keep tabs on me? He said and Ace laughed. Nope, this time it was me. What kind of trouble are you in this time? He asked Luffy, who chuckled. I'm not in trouble. He wasn't, at least not now anyway. Yet brat, you're not in trouble yet. Someone had called in the background. Have you found those Nakama of yours yet? Ace asked him and Luffy nodded. I have Zoro, Nami, and Usopp. Right now we're just about to find Sanji, but something feels weird. He looked out the window, a weird feeling in his gut. What kind of weird, Yoi? Marco asked him. I think I'm going to be fighting someone soon, but I could be wrong. Luffy knew someone with a lot of power was coming their way. The feeling it was giving him was almost familiar. The pops, you didn't send anyone out to visit me in surprise, right? Luffy asked, knowing they were by his pop's chair. No, my son, we know your wishes to do this alone. Luffy nodded, knowing pops held things like freedom as highly as Luffy did. Someone familiar is coming my way, but I don't know who. Luffy was good at pinpointing the way he felt around people. Being raised in the New World taught him that anyone could be considered an enemy if they weren't part of your family. By judging his feelings on people, Luffy had kept himself relatively safe growing up. Keep yourself safe, Lu. Ace warned, and Marco nodded. If you need us, we will be there, Yoi. And he would be, if Luffy so much as asked, he would come in a heartbeat, probably with Ace and half the crew behind him, make that the entirety of the crew. This is the East Blue, it's not that exciting really. He felt he might need to remind them where he was before an Emperor's crew showed up there, scaring every marine and village alike. Just remember, we have your back, that's all, kid. Thatch said to Luffy, who nodded before a knock could be heard on the door. Luffy, Yoi? Marco asked, realizing that they were losing the kid's attention. Sanji opened the door to see Luffy sitting by the window, the transponder snail awake. I can come back later. He said, and Luffy shook his head. I'm heading out, I'll call you guys when something interesting happens. Luffy said to his family. Sanji? Ace asked and the blonde made his way over to the phone. I recognize your shitty voice. But Sanji was smiling down at it. Asshole, take care of my brother. Ace said, but he too was smiling. Bye guys. Luffy called before hanging up the phone and turning toward Sanji. What's up? Sanji lit his smoke before he sighed. You really bring trouble everywhere you go, don't you? Looking at the hole in the ceiling, Luffy smiled. It was an accident, I swear. He said, and Sanji shook his head. Help me serve these shitty customers and I'll forgive you for the accident. He said, once again looking up at the hole, shaking his head. Fine, but only if you feed me afterwards. Luffy jumped off the windowsill and followed Sanji to the dining hall. The Sanji. Luffy stopped and looked at his friend just before he entered the hall. Join my crew. Luffy said with a big toothy grin, causing Sanji to make a face before laughing. Don't joke, shithead. He said as Luffy just laughed since Sanji didn't quite say no, not like he'd ever accept a no from him. Shishishi. He laughed walking past his friend. We have work to do, so don't mess up. Sanji grabbed an apron from one of the staff areas and threw it towards Luffy. Looking good, Luffy. Nami yelled and waved towards their captain, who scowled once he saw they were eating something. Mr. Waiter, I'd like to order some more drinks if you don't mind. Zoro said, laughing silently at Luffy, who had his finger up his nose, then flicking his snot into Zoro's drink when the man wasn't looking. This water is boring, I'd like some rum. Zoro said, picking up his contaminated drink as everyone snickered around the table. Zoro, not being weak, knew Luffy had done something to his drink, so smiling he tipped the cup to his lips before grabbing Luffy's neck and forcing him to drink the bad water. Try something like that again and I'll cut you up. He said, but there was no anger in his voice, only humor. Is that any way to talk with beautiful ladies that close by? Especially someone as extravagant as you, mademoiselle? Sanji asked Nami, bowing to his knee and taking her hand before glaring at Zoro, who just raised a brow and grunted at the newcomer. What was that? Zoro asked as Luffy grabbed Sanji, throwing an arm around his shoulder. This guy's going to be our cook. Luffy said to the crew, and Sanji pushed him off, scowling at him. I agreed to nothing, Luffy. Now are you going to help or not? Zoro glared at the blonde man, hoping Luffy was just kidding about having him join. Men, coming. He called to Sanji, waving at his friends, who found it rather funny and refreshing to see Luffy helping out and acting sort of normal. Helping with the dinner service, F rewarded his crew by letting them stay the night in some of the upstairs rooms. Even though you blew a hole through my roof, which I shall send the bill to your family for, Brad, and broke many of my dishes, good work, kid. Zeph said, causing Luffy to smile. Thanks for the food. Luffy replied, stuffing his face with meat. It's been such a long time since you've been back, I'm surprised those shitty brothers of yours didn't follow you. Sanji said, smiling while thinking of Ace and Sabo. Sabo's on his own adventure with my birth father, and Ace probably wanted to follow me. Luffy knew that if given the chance, Marco and Ace would be stalking him across the world, and only didn't because Pops wouldn't let them. Marco would obey instantly, mostly because he was a grown man who knew boundaries, but Ace, who knows. So Sabo went off on his own. Sanji remembered how protective that brother was, so for him to be away from Luffy and Ace was surprising to him. Sabo has his own adventures just like Ace, and I do. When we meet again, we'll tell each other all about them. Luffy couldn't wait until he met his brother again, but he was somewhat patient. I'm shutting the kitchen down, so let's head to bed. Sanji turned the lights off and headed towards the stairs. Zoro is already up there with Usopp, so I'll be up in a moment. I have something I need to do first. Luffy said with a grin. If you say so, just don't fall in the water, please. Sanji sighed before waving at Luffy and continuing up the stairs. The stars are a little different here than they are back home. Luffy said, walking on the deck of the Mary, startling Nami. Are you good at reading them? She asked him, and he laughed loudly. Nope, I just like to look at them. Even when the sun goes down and darkness fills the sky, there is always a little light because of the stars. He said, and Nami giggled. I didn't know you were such a philosopher. She said to him, causing him to blink, not recognizing the word, so he chose to ignore it. You can't stay long, huh? He asked her, causing her to turn her head towards him quickly, her eyes wide. What do you? She began, but Luffy shook his head. Nothing, I don't know anything, and I don't really care about anything. Your past is yours, but you're my friend, and I just want to help where I can. I'd help any of my nakama no matter what, because that's what families do for each other. He said to her, putting his hands behind his head, staring up at the stars. The straw hat fluttered slightly in the cool ocean wind as Nami looked away, shadows over her eyes. It's a long story. She sighed, and Luffy nodded. I don't want to hear it then. Long stories weren't his thing. He's not a kid anymore, and Pops has told him enough stories for quite a while. My village needs me. She pretty much made her long story short that way, causing him to nod. What do you want me to do? He needed her to ask him for help, otherwise he could do nothing. You're from the Grand Line, right? She asked him and he nodded again. Are you really one of WhiteBeard's sons? She knew that this question bothered him because names were not something he cared much for. Luffy cared about you by the actions you did, not by the title you carried. Yes, I am. His voice was strained, but she needed to know this. Prove it. If he truly was a WhiteBeard pirate, maybe, just maybe, he could stand up against Arlong. Looking at her through the shadows of night, he lifted up his shirt, showing his back to her and the tattoo that was on it. That is Pop's mark and my ma's feather. That was proof enough for her to nod silently as he pulled his shirt down. Nami, what do you want me to do? He asked her once again, this time fully turned towards her. Nami placed her hand on her shoulder over the tattoo that had haunted her for most of her life. I want you to save me. Luffy had got the confirmation he needed from Nami, and so he would do as she asked. Do you want to hear the whole story? She sighed, but Luffy pushed himself away from the railing, a small smile on his face. Nope, I said I wasn't interested and I meant it. Just show me where to go and I'll fight whatever or whoever is hurting you. He laughed to himself and Nami smiled at him, shaking her head. I need to get back to my village as soon as possible. She knew there wasn't much time left. Tomorrow take the Mary, we'll meet you there. Luffy knew that Zoro's friends had a small ship so they could get him there just as fast. But you don't know where to go, idiot. Turning away from the water, Nami pulled out a rolled up wanted poster and showed it to Luffy. This is Arlong, those friends of Zoro's, Johnny and Yusaku, they're bounty hunters, they should know where he is. Nami knew Luffy would find his way to her village regardless, but giving him a hint to find it would be better than him and Zoro going in circles while she wasn't there. Right, I'll give this to them. He rolled it back up and stuffed it into his pocket. Tomorrow is going to be an interesting day, Luffy said softly, jumping from Mary onto the deck of the Bereti. Interesting, that's a great way of putting it. She sighed, joining him as both went their separate ways into their own rooms. What were you doing out there all alone with the beautiful Nami Swan? Sanji growled once Luffy was in his room. Talking. Simple, because that was all he was doing. Luffy. Sanji said his friend name through gritted teeth as Luffy ignored him, heading to the same place he had slept years ago. I'm tired, can we do this tomorrow? He whined, and Sanji closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Fine, but you're getting up early with me, shithead. He would interrogate the kid tomorrow morning while making breakfast. Sanji, like many who had met the boy, knew full well that Luffy could be bribed with food. Fine. As soon as Luffy's head hit his pillow, he was out like a light. Haven't changed a bit, have you, shithead? Sanji smiled, getting into his own bed, but it was relieving to know that Luffy, even after all these years, was still the same meat-loving kid he had met. Night. He whispered before rolling over, getting no answer, but snores in return. When morning came, Luffy didn't complain, getting up to watch Sanji cook breakfast for the restaurant. When can I eat? He mumbled to himself, rubbing his eyes and yawning. When prep's finished, the restaurant comes first, then we can eat. Sanji said, peeling more potatoes swiftly. But I'm hungry now. He whined some more, hoping Sanji would give in to him and feed the loud whiner. Here, eat this. Zeph had entered the kitchen and threw an apple Luffy's way. That won't fill me up at all. Luffy said, taking a bite, and Zeph laughed to himself. I don't expect it to, I just want you to stop whining. I've got enough to deal with this kid around. Zeph said, looking toward Sanji, who had a tick appear on his head. Shut it, you shitty old man. Sanji grumbled out, but his words were almost spoken out of habit. The exchange between Sanji and Zeph reminded Luffy so much of home he couldn't help but smile at them. What's with that look, brat? Zeph asked Luffy, who stood up, then stole half the plate of bacon before grinning back at them. You guys just remind me of home. Swallowing all the pieces quickly before Sanji and the other chefs yelled at him, Luffy took off to find Zoro and the others. Damn brat, giving us more work to do. Zeph smiled and Sanji sighed, placing more strips of bacon back on the pan. Nothing new, he's still the same shitty bastard he was last time we saw him. Breakfast had rolled around and the place was filled. Hey Luffy, why is your chef friend helping out in the front if he's a cook? Usopp asked, pointing toward Sanji, who was bringing people food and drinks. From what I remember, this place can get a bit rowdy, so a lot of the waiters quit. Luffy said, remembering how a few waiters walked out when he came a few years ago. So we get dinner and a show here. Not a bad deal. Zoro grinned, leaning back in his chair. Well, it's no wonder, this place is really close to the Grand Line. People probably stop here before going over to that sea. Nami said, and Luffy nodded his head but wasn't really listening. Waiter. A man called and Sanji turned and looking in direction, a brow raised at him. Luffy thought he recognized the man calling Sanji, but then again he wasn't sure either. Sighing, Sanji walked over to the man who was holding his wine up and smelling it with a look of glee on his face. Yes. Sanji asked. This guy wasn't a lady, so he saw no need to be formal with him. The man went on to describe the wine Sanji had given him only a few moments earlier, asking if it was a famous brand, and Sanji almost rolled his eyes. No, you're not even close, eat up this dish, it's best when it's hot. Sanji said, forcing a spoon into the man's hand as the restaurant began laughing at the man who had just been humiliated. What were you saying about dinner and a show? Nami snickered, even Zoro couldn't fight off a small smile at the marine's poor fortune. Sanji began to walk away before stopping and turning back at the man, glaring slightly. Sir, also my name is Sanji, I'm the South chef. All the waiters ran off and our volunteer is sitting on his ass eating more of our food. Sanji felt ticks appearing on his head as Luffy was stuffing his face some more. Even though Luffy was stuffing his face with the breakfast Zoro and the others had on their table, he couldn't stop his eyes from watching what the weird man was going to do next. He could see that the guy was angry after being humiliated, but would he make a bigger fool of himself over one person's words? Luffy then let his eyes drift over to Sanji, curious as to what he might do if this guy flew off the handle. Hey waiter. The man shouted again, and Sanji gritted his teeth at being shouted at by some guy. What now? He asked, his tone clearly said he was annoyed. How can you expect me to eat this garbage? There's a bug in my soup. He shouted, showing Sanji the soup that did in fact hold a bug floating in it. Sanji sighed, shaking his head and removing the bug before turning to the lady beside him. I'm so sorry my lady, to have a date like him must truly be embarrassing. Sanji said sadly, placing his hand on hers, causing her to giggle and others to snicker at the scene. The man stood up, then smashed the table in, breaking all of the dishes and destroying the food that was in them. Everyone could feel the air in the room change as Sanji kneeled down to pick up a piece of glass, staring at it and the mess on the floor. If you had just picked out the bug, it would have still be good. I spent 3 whole days and nights working on this soup with care, and now because of you shithead it's been wasted. Sanji's voice took on a deadly coolness that threatened any around him. Luffy didn't smile at the scene but took on his poker face and stopped eating altogether. Luffy had learned from a very early age that wasting food was a sin on any ship. Food was hard to come by when you're sailing away from islands, and hunger doesn't care how many people need to eat. What this man has done would have earned him a beating, followed closely by a saltwater bath had Thatch been here to see this. The man, not understanding the danger he was in, decided to mock Sanji on his customer service by stepping on his hand and squishing his foot to add more pressure. He mocked Sanji some more, but the blonde didn't even flinch because he was so mad. Only when the beautiful lady tried to interfere did Sanji look up. The man had thrown the lady back away from him, knocking her over, and that was the last straw for him. Can money fill your stomach? Sanji asked in a deadly whisper, and the man just stared confused. Can money fill your stomach? Sanji repeated, but his calmness was fading as shadows took over his face, and before anyone knew it he was up and moving. Sanji dropped to his hands and used his strong legs to teach this marine a lesson. This was the first time Luffy had seen Sanji fight, so his poker face broke and a huge grin took over in its place. Sanji grabbed the bleeding man from the floor and held him up to his eyes level to speak to him fully. Don't go ruining a good dish. Messing with a chef of the sea is a pretty good and easy way to get yourself killed. Sanji said before dropping him into the mess on the floor and walking away. Are you sure about this guy Luffy? Zoro asked, not impressed with the show like Luffy was. Yup, he's the only one who will cook for our crew. Luffy said seriously, but the grin on his face and the way he was vibrating in excitement was showing his true emotions. Luffy thought Sanji looked cool enough to be one of them. Zeph came down from the kitchens along with many of the other chefs to see what was going on. Sanji. Don't you get it, customers are kings. A large man with bulky arms shouted as Zeph walked toward Sanji and the man. Eddie, Sanji, if you wish to fight please do it elsewhere. Zeph then looked towards the mess while walking toward Sanji, and what is the meaning of this Sanji? Zeph asked, staring down at the bloody marine who was beginning to get back on his feet. He wasted food. Sanji simply said as Paddy let him go. Zeph closed his eyes before bringing his peg leg up and kicking Sanji over the head, knocking him to the ground. So you thought it was a good idea to teach him a lesson then, eh? Zeph asked Sanji, who was growling on the floor up at Zeph as Full Body got back up, grinning in triumph over Sanji. You see, that's what customer service really is. He snarled down at Sanji, who just glared as Zeph kicked Full Body as well. What the hell is wrong with you people? He shouted at Zeph, who just gave him a dirty look. That's for wasting food in my restaurant, now get out. He shouted at the marine who was ready to run off the ship when the front doors were slammed open. A man who looked pale and thin walked in carefully as if he wasn't about to fall over from exhaustion and what appeared to be starvation. It looks like another customer has arrived. Paddy said, staring at the man, and even Sanji was giving him a look, but instead of anger it was almost a look of pity. The man sat down in one of the chairs, his face thin and his stomach growling in agony. I don't care what it is, just bring me food right now. He called out to whoever was listening. Paddy welcomed him in a polite way, but Sanji knew Paddy well enough now to know it was a false kindness. Do you have any money to pay for this meal, shit customer? Paddy asked him, and the man pulled a gun from his cloths pointing it at Paddy. How about a bullet through the head? He said in anger, but Paddy wasn't afraid. If you don't have any money then you're not welcome to eat here. Go starve somewhere else. Paddy then threw the man out of the restaurant, leaving a relieved amount of people that the bad scary pirate had been dealt with. Luffy watched as Sanji turned and silently left the dining room towards the kitchen and smiled knowing Zeph had seen the same thing. He wanted to follow Sanji, but that feeling of familiarity was returning full force, whoever was coming towards him was almost here and a whole lot of trouble would happen right afterwards. Nami. Though Luffy said her name neither looked at one another. Man. She knew he was giving her the chance to leave soon, but the timing felt off. Someone's coming and when they get here I want you to go. He said slowly ignoring Zoro's eyes watching the two of them. Who is it? Nami asked quietly, but Luffy shook his head not knowing quite yet himself. No, just do what you have to. She nodded understanding as Luffy stood up and walked towards the kitchens hoping to find Sanji and see what he was going to do about that hungry guy. I missed him. Leaving the kitchen Luffy went outside to check on the weird guy instead, only to see Sanji place some food down in front of him. The guy refused the food only for Sanji to give him some good advice to keep living. The things Luffy saw here was the reason he had chosen Sanji to be his cook. Sanji had heart and that was something Luffy respected in a person. You're lucky you know, if Sanji hadn't fed you you'd probably be dead. Luffy said not sugarcoating his words as the man was sitting up from his deep bow to Sanji. You two know each other? The man asked and Luffy nodded excitedly. Sanji's my cook on my crew. Sanji felt a tick appear on his head. Don't make shit up Luffy. He sighed but was flattered that Luffy wanted him, but his responsibility to this restaurant was more important than his dream. I'm not, I already decided. All Sanji did was shake his head knowing that he would be arguing with Luffy until the sun went down if he got into a fight right now. So you're a pirate? The guy asked and Luffy laughed loudly. Of course. There was nothing in this world Luffy would ever want to be. So you really did set out on your own this time? Sanji said and Luffy pouted slightly. Haven't you been listening to me? You're going to be the cook on my ship. Luffy shouted but Sanji interrupted him. Later Luffy. Because later he would put the kid in his place if he continued to pressure him like that. Sorry to interrupt but my name is Jin and I'm a member of Don Krieg's pirate fleet. Jin said bowing again and Luffy closed his eyes wishing he had spent more time with Harita learning about the rival pirates. Then again even if he had spent more time with her he still probably wouldn't know any of them either way. I'm Luffy and I'm going to be the Pirate King. He said giving his trademark smile. Pirate King? Does this mean you're heading towards the Grand Line? Jin asked but the man looked frightened. Man, I have people waiting for me there. Honestly he couldn't wait to get back into home waters. The East Blue was fun at first but now it was getting boring. If I were you I'd avoid the place no matter if people are waiting for you there or not. Jin recommended but Luffy stopped smiling at that. Why? I know paradise is crazy but it can't be as bad as the new world. Luffy tried to think back to the times he was in paradise with his pops and truly didn't think it was as bad as Jin was saying. Paradise, they call that place the pirate's graveyard. Jin shouted at him and Sanji felt like telling the man to save his breath with Luffy. Yeah, only if you're weak. Jin didn't like hearing those words from Luffy, especially since the kid said it with a smile. What happened? Sanji asked lighting a new smoke. I don't even know. We were just getting in when this man came out of nowhere and began to slice everything. I didn't even think my captain would escape but he did. The thought of going back and running into a monster than that man is terrifying. Jin closed his eyes trying to block out those memories. Sanji blew out some smoke, his eyes drifted over to Luffy who was frowning. I must return to Don Krieg as soon as possible. Sanji, Luffy, thank you for everything, it means a lot to me and I hope we meet again someday. Jin said and Luffy laughed softly waving goodbye to the man as he sailed away on a small boat. Luffy? Sanji was still staring towards the water. Is the Grand Line that bad? He had taken Jin's words seriously so Luffy thought about it for a moment. Depends on who you run into I guess. There are a lot of strong people there but that's why you should only go if you're strong, otherwise someone stronger will wipe you out. Luffy said having seen his family take out newcomers quite often. Boy brats, don't you have work to do? Zeph was standing over the balcony looking down at them but his eyes were turned on to the Straw Hat Kid. Why do I have to work more? Luffy asked and Zeph smiled. Because it was you who blew that hole through my roof. Zeph said but Luffy knew that it was just a new joke for the old man to laugh at. Luffy grumbled about the extra work but didn't say no as Sanji threw the empty dishes into the sea and smirked at the old man who shook his head and headed back inside. Would you throw the dishes away? He was confused on Sanji's actions. If there are no dishes then there is no proof that I fed Jin. It was as simple as that but it was enough for Luffy to get it. The afternoon began to pass with Luffy helping the restaurant and Nami preparing the Mary secretly. Luffy was leaning back in a chair watching Sanji work since he had given up when his observation haki alerted him to something was coming. "What's going on?" Sanji asked as Luffy silently got up and looked out the restaurant at a broken ship approaching them. Everyone followed him to see what was happening. That's when many began to shake in fear, knowing already who was at their front door. Sanji and Zeph just stared up at the ship, a look of annoyance on both of their faces. Luffy started to look closely at the ship, his eyes widening when he realized he recognized just what had happened to that poor thing. "Of all the people you guys ran into him," Luffy whispered, recognizing his uncle's work from training with him. "It doesn't seem like the damage was from cannon," Sanji said, trying to see why Luffy had gone silent, which was rare. "It's not, and if they're still alive." Luffy felt like turning away knowing that his uncle didn't let his prey leave him alive. Realization hit him then, and the feeling he recognized for the past day and a half became clear. His uncle was on his way to finish off this ship. The man in armor stepped forward on the ship, but his appearance was pale and thin, showing he hadn't eaten in many days. Mildly to Sanji and Luffy's surprise, Jin was supporting the man into the place, so they guessed this must be his captain. The man begged for food, which many of the people protested about. No one wanted the guy to have enough strength to get back on his feet and kill everyone. "Luffy, just how strong are you?" Sanji whispered to Luffy, who was giving a blank face at the scene. "I'm strong. I've faced people much stronger than these guys back home." The guy also looked too weak to fight, and Luffy wasn't one for taking advantage of people at their weakest. So if something happens, Sanji needed to know if Luffy would help defend their ship. "You guys are my friends, and no one hurts my friends and gets away with it," Luffy clarified, and Sanji nodded, understanding that Luffy would help. The man was begging, and even though Sanji had the feeling that something was going to happen, he went and grabbed some food and wine for the man. Placing the things in front of Jin and his captain, he couldn't help but smile. Jin felt like crying in gratitude towards the chef who had been so kind to him. Krieg thanked Sanji as he stuffed the food in his mouth, not even bothering with a fork, he was so starved. One of the chefs went running past Luffy towards Sanji, shouting things, asking Sanji if he knew who this man was. He stated that the guy starving was the ruler of the East Blue, one of the strongest pirates around. Luffy looked closer at the man and shook his head, almost laughing at that statement. Strongest of the pirates. These people must never have met his pops and siblings before. The chef went on to tell all of the bad things this guy had done, and even Luffy had to admit they were pretty bad. Just as Luffy was deciding he really didn't like this guy, Krieg got up and knocked Sanji off his feet, ensuring Luffy's dislike towards him. Jin shouted at Krieg, but the man broke his arm once he stood up. People like Krieg really pissed Luffy off, just like that cat guy, what's his name, this guy didn't deserve to be a captain of any crew. "This is a pretty nice ship, I think I'll take it from you people," he said, looking around. "On my ship there are about 100 men who are starving. If you value your lives, make something for them to eat, then get the hell off this ship," he said as Jin was begging him not to do anything. Sanji was getting up slowly. The attack knocked the breath out of him since he wasn't expecting it, though really he should have been. Once he was able to get back up on his feet, Sanji turned towards the kitchens to make the meals ordered to him. "Sanji?" Luffy was considering kicking this guy's butt but wanted to wait for Sanji to ask first. "These orders aren't going to make themselves, once they're finished do as you like," Sanji said to Luffy, then finished walking towards the kitchen. "That's what I wanted to hear." The chef, Patty, wasn't so open to helping the pirates and made that clear by pulling out a large gun and shooting a cannon at the pirate captain, sending him backwards. Luffy was stunned on what was going on, but the excitement in the air was something he hadn't felt since he was back home. Don Krieg got back up rather quickly and began to shoot the chefs with guns underneath his shoulder armor. Krieg then shouted at them that they should follow his orders and never to disobey him. Of course the chefs were ready to stand back up and fight again when Zeph dropped a large bag of food in front of the man. "Take your orders and get out," he said as many chefs yelled to him. "You're red foot, Zeph," Krieg said, and Zeph just stared at him. Luffy was looking at the old guy now, curious on who he was. The chefs were shouting at Zeph, but the old man just walked away before turning back to look at him. "You want this restaurant, fine, but tell me, do your men have the will left to fight? Did your will survive your defeat?" Zeph asked him, and many turned to look at Krieg now in shock at the knowledge that he was defeated. One of them was talking about how Krieg, who had a fleet of 50 ships, couldn't make it on the Grand Line without having to turn back. The Grand Line? So this guy really did get jazzed out of paradise by Uncle Luffy closed his eyes, knowing soon enough Haki would be here soon to finish the job. During Luffy's musings, Krieg started to tell the tale of Zeph and the rumors that came along with him. "Enough chit-chat here, what do you want from me?" Zeph asked, bring Luffy back to the conversation. "Redfoot Zeph, you survived the merciless waters of the Grand Line for an entire year. I want your captain's log on how you did it." Krieg set a shadow over his face showing he was going to try and take that log no matter what. What an idiot. Luffy said suddenly causing the man to turn his eyes towards Luffy who had his hands behind his head and eyes closed. What was that brat? Krieg growled towards Luffy who opened an eye to look at him. You're an idiot. You failed in the first waters of paradise, even with that log thingy, do you really think you'd get far? Luffy asked him, which shocked a few people on who Luffy was talking to this pirate. Boy, don't you know who this guy is? One person shouted at Luffy who shrugged. Why should I care? Luffy was bored and now hungry, maybe the old man left some extra food in the back for him. What do you know of the Grand Line, brat? With that shout Sanji felt like laughing. So far more than you do you really think the guy who turned your ship into firewood is really going to just let you go? Luffy asked, his voice a deadly softness to it. Just saying. You know nothing, boy. I only failed because I didn't have enough information. But now I can fix all of that. Once I have your logbook I will form another fleet and seize the legendary treasure, becoming the Pirate King. Krieg said as Luffy's brow twitched in annoyance. No way, I'm the one who will be the Pirate King. I won't allow such a brat to talk to me like that, this isn't a game, kid. Krieg said, anger building even more now that this kid wouldn't stop butting in. Yeah, I know, I'm still going to be the one who will conquer the Grand Line. Luffy said cockily to the man whose anger was bursting over now. No, you won't. We didn't have the right information, but my fleet of 5,000 men were wiped out in only 7 days, you brat. That sea is just plain hell. Krieg shouted at Luffy, and even Zeph had to fight off the smirk Sanji was sporting. Hell is it? Well, that's just fine for me. Luffy said, thinking about how much he missed home waters. Unlike you, I don't find anything you're saying to be funny. If you keep talking, kid, I'll crush you right here and now. Krieg said, and Luffy grabbed his arm showing he was ready to fight. Go ahead if you want, unlike you I've lasted more than 7 days in paradise. He had to get in a few more jabs at the man's pride. You know it would be my pleasure to send you to an early grave. Krieg threatened. Sanji moved towards Zeph and whispered to him something that caused the smile he had been fighting off. Think we should tell this guy whose crew Luffy comes from? Sanji asked, and Zeph shook his head. Why don't we keep that little bit of information to ourselves for now? Even if Krieg made it through paradise, if word ever reached that Emperor's crew that Luffy had been threatened, no matter the number, Krieg's crew would have been destroyed. Luffy, we don't have all day to play with weaklings like him. Luffy didn't have to turn around to know Zoro was there with Usopp, who surprisingly stood tall beside the swordsman. It's not like these guys could touch Luffy either way. Usopp said, bringing a larger smile to Luffy's face, not because of the compliment, but because Luffy could hear the quiver of fear in his sniper's voice. Hey guys, Thatch said it's rude not to listen to people who challenge you even if they're weak. Luffy said, looking back at his friends. Are those 2 people a part of your crew? What a small group, you guys would never make it on the Grand Line. Krieg laughed, which was beginning to annoy Luffy with all this never make it talk. They're not all, I still have 2 other members. He said, holding up 2 fingers towards Krieg as Sanji shouted at him. Krieg looked down at Luffy and Zeph before picking up his bag of food and making his way out of the ship, not before giving the group his warning to leave or die. Once he left, Luffy turned to look at Zeph, hoping to get the old man to understand what was going to happen. I don't like getting involved in things like this. Luffy began as Usopp shouted at him, saying he got involved in this stuff all the time. But I can't leave things as they are. I'm stronger than that guy, so there's nothing to worry about if you just let me kick his ass. Luffy said to Zeph, his face serious but almost blank. Kid, you're brave, I'll give you that, but what makes you think you stand a chance against Don Krieg? Patty shouted at Luffy, but Zeph placed a hand on the chef's shoulder, stopping him. If anyone stands a chance against Krieg, it would be you, boy. If one of WhiteBeard's sons can't stop him, no one can. Zeph turned away, leaving a bunch of people staring at Luffy funny, and even a few dropped jaws. Even if you're one of his sons, how can you actually stop him by yourself? A chef shouted in fear. I've been fighting pirates since I dunno, I was 10, maybe 12. It didn't matter really to Luffy though, that guy's only strong because he has a lot of people, but if the people are weak, does it matter the number? Pops had a lot of sons, but each and every one of them could kick ass on any given day. Boy, old man, don't tell Pops and Ma what's going on. He really didn't feel like dealing with home again just yet. Wasn't planning on it, brat. Zeph said, sitting down in a chair. Luffy walked up to him and squatted down to look at him. There's something I want to try on those guys, but I need you to keep your friends away from me while I do it. Zeph raised a brow at him, telling him to explain. Sometimes when I'm mad at people, something happens and they end up falling asleep. He said, thinking back to the times he used his weird feeling. That sounds like hockey. Zeph was no stranger to hockey, he had been to the New World a few times. Right, that's what Ma called it. But it's not like my other hockey abilities. I want to try and use that one on them, but I don't know if I can. Luffy had only been able to randomly use that haki. It was so unpredictable that he was taking a risk even mentioning it. And if it doesn't work? Zeph asked. Then I'll still kick all their asses either way. While Luffy and Zeph were having their quiet conversation, the chefs were getting worked up, grabbing weapons and knives to help defend the restaurant alongside Luffy. "Kid, I don't care whose son you are, if you're going to fight to protect this place, then we'll help you," they said, and Luffy smiled at them, nodding. Zoro and Usopp looked down at Luffy, a grin on their faces at the way he was handling himself in this situation. All was starting to feel normal when Johnny and Yusaku barged into the place, freaking out. "What's going on?" Zoro asked them, walking towards them. "It's Nami, sis. She's taken off with the ship and the treasure." Usopp paled and Zoro gritted his teeth at the news. "What? How dare she?" Usopp growled, since that ship was a gift from Kaya. "Luffy, did you hear?" Zoro asked his captain, who didn't seem to react at all. "Yeah, I already know," he said, shrugging, causing the small group to look at him. "What do you mean you know?" Zoro asked slowly. "I told her to, she has something she needs to take care of, so I told her to go on ahead." Zoro closed his eyes, calming his nerves, knowing that Nami hadn't betrayed them if Luffy ordered her to go on without them. "Why didn't you tell us?" Usopp asked, confused. "It's been kinda busy here, I didn't really have much time," he said honestly, then turned to Jin. "I think I know what happened to you guys when you got to the Grand Line," Luffy said sadly to the man who was still on the floor shivering in fear. "You, because I still don't understand what happened. One man came out of nowhere, has destroyed all of our ships like it was nothing. If a storm hadn't have happened, he might have destroyed our flagship as well. I just want to forget. It was like a terrible nightmare." His eyes were like a hawk's, cold and murderous, his gaze alone felt like we were all going to die. Jin said, which made Luffy feel pity for the man. Zoro was now gripping the railing to the stairs tightly, knowing just who was being talked about. "I'm sorry, of all the people you could have run into, it had to be him." Luffy remembered Mihawk's eyes all too well and the fear they could bring if they were set upon you in anger, but mostly boredom. "That can only be the one known as Hawkeye, your description of him is dead on," Zeph said, his gaze catching Luffy. "You were a fool to think he'd just let you go," Luffy said, walking out of the restaurant with Zoro following behind him. "Hawkeye Mihawk is the man I have been searching for," Zoro said to Luffy, who nodded, sensing Usopp right behind them. "I know you want to meet him, but Nami is going to need our help and I promised her I'd save her." Luffy turned to look at Zoro full on. "I want you to take Johnny and Yusaku and go after her," he said, then turned to Usopp. "I have this is the one we will be dealing with next. I can't come yet since I have stuff to deal with here and need to get Sanji to officially join, so go on without me." "Alright, we'll go after her. You can count on us," Usopp said, and Luffy thanked him, smiling as Usopp ran off to get Johnny and Yusaku ready to go. Zoro the swordsman sighed but nodded. "She's one of us," he said, rubbing the back of his head in defeat. "She needs us, all of us." Luffy smiled but realized that the pirates on the other broken ship were beginning to freak out. "What's their problem?" Luffy asked, but a feeling he really didn't need hit him hard. "Why now, uncle?" he growled under his breath, causing Zoro to look at him funny. "I can't believe he followed us all the way from the Grand Line," Krieg shouted in fear and anger. As a bunch of pirates began to shout battle cries ready to attack the restaurant, a few slices were made along the ship, breaking it into even more pieces. Everyone's eyes widened, but Luffy frowned at the man he loved like an uncle. Zoro was practically shaking from seeing the man he had sworn to defeat before him so soon. Luffy took off to try and get as close as he could without him drowning in the sea to see his uncle and maybe get him to go away now that he's finished cutting up that ship. Zeph walked out beside Luffy at the ship's edge, his eyes wide as he caught sight of the man who just cut that giant ship. "That man is Hawkeye," Zeph said, confirming to Zoro that this was in fact the man he was looking for. "Zoro," Luffy said softly, but his eyes never left Mihawk. "Luffy, that's the man I've been looking for." Zoro's eyes were overshadowed as Luffy's own hat darkened his face. "You promised Luffy that you wouldn't get in the way of my ambition," Zoro said, walking towards Mihawk, who had sailed closer to the ships. Luffy didn't say anything because Zoro was right, he did promise not to get in his way. "I've never seen a sword handled so gently or with amazing grace," Zoro complimented Mihawk, who turned his eyes towards Zoro. "There's no grace in swords play based on force," he drawled out in a dry tone. "Was it you who destroyed this ship?" Zoro asked, but Mihawk didn't even look at him. "Then it is true, you're the best," Zoro said, the large grin on his face showing his excitement. "I set sail with 2 reasons. The first was to find you and the second was to meet up with my captain," Zoro said, touching his sword. "And what is your goal then?" Mihawk asked. "To beat you and become the best." Mihawk could hear the determination behind this kid's voice, but determination was nothing without strength to back it up. Zoro tied his bandana over his head, showing Luffy he was serious as he pulled out his blade. You've got some spare time so let's do this. Zoro said smirking, but Mihik turned his eyes towards another who was watching them carefully. Are you really going to let me kill one of your crewmates Luffy? Mihik asked, stunning Zoro and everyone else who was now turning towards Luffy, their mouths dropped, their eyes wide. Yeah, I'd like you not to do that, Uncle Haki. The chefs were all starstruck with the way Luffy was talking to Mihik. Zeph laughed quietly, knowing this kid had some sort of gift on how to get past people's defenses like this. You know from experience I don't show mercy to those who challenge me. Mihik said to him, and Luffy nodded, remembering all the times his uncle tried to slice him to bits during his 1-week training. Zoro had enough, so he turned to Luffy in surprise and even anger for not knowing this information. Why didn't you tell me? He shouted as Luffy shrugged at him. It never really came up, and would it have changed anything? Zoro would still go after Haki no matter what, so the information wasn't really needed. Also, Luffy had forgotten all about his uncle for a while and focused on his new crew. Enough, are you here to challenge me or not? Mihik asked, getting bored of this. Yeah, I'm still calling you out, Mihik. He said, deciding to deal with Luffy later. If you truly are a competent swordsman, then you should be able to tell the differences between our skills even before we cross blades. I do wish to know why you are challenging me. I know Luffy is a stubborn fool, but I expected better from his crewmates. Mihik said, looking Zoro over. It is my ambition that drives me, that and a promise. Zoro said, placing one of his swords in his mouth and the others in his hands ready to fight. You've begun to coat your blades in armament. Mihik said, slightly impressed for a man from the East Blue. Luffy isn't the only strong one. He said, but Mihik looked at him sternly, if not in that same bored expression. Strength comes in many different forms, and while you have begun learning Haki, can you use it to the best of its abilities? He asked. Zoro just positioned himself to fight. Luffy knew Zoro was going to lose the moment he stepped forward in front of Mihik. The only thing keeping him on that railing was the promise he had made with Zoro not to interfere with his dreams, even if it got him killed. Mihik pulled the cross from around his neck and shows that it was a small dagger pointing at Zoro. What do you think you'll do with that? Zoro asked, shocked at the small blade. It will be more than enough for you. I mean, would you really wish to kill a fly with a cannon? Mihik said. Luffy's eyes widened at the humility that was being given to Zoro. Even when Luffy was being trained by Haki, the black blade was used to attack him day and night. You may have a reputation here on the East Blue, but this sea is the weakest of them all, isn't that right, Luffy? Mihik asked, but didn't turn his eyes away from Zoro. Man, Luffy whispered, knowing full well how slow this sea was compared to the Grand Line. Unfortunately, I don't carry any blade smaller than this one, so it will have to do. He said, causing Zoro to shake slightly in anger. I've had about enough of you and your stupid attitude. Zoro shouted before moving into attack. You are still too small with no real idea how big this world really is. Mihik said under his breath in what Luffy discovered might have been anger, but it was the first time he had heard that tone come from his uncle. Zoro's attack was easily stopped with that small blade, even if the three of his were tipped in Haki. Mihik's skills was far more superior to Zoro's. Luffy sat on the sidelines but watched the battle carefully, but sitting out really hurt him. He wanted to help fight and protect his nakama, but how can he do that if they didn't let him in? The battle carried on, but it wasn't much of a battle. While Zoro was strong now and he had been training, Mihik was New World strong and Zoro was barely first half of the Grand Line strong. It wasn't until Mihik stabbed Zoro with his small dagger that Luffy stood up and growled, his protective nature telling him to fight. You have lost yet you won't step back. Why is that? Mihik asked, the blade still in Zoro's chest. Because if I step back I would be shattering the promises I have made, and for that I will not run. I would lose my honor, and without that I would have absolutely nothing left. Zoro said, keeping eye contact with Mihik. But that is exactly what defeat is, losing your honor. Mihik clarified for the boy. Then I won't accept that. He said stubbornly. Then you shall die here. Mihik was giving him an escape, but this boy refused to move. I'd rather die than step away and give up. Zoro said sternly. Mihik stared at him a little longer before removing the blade and putting it away. What is your name? Mihik asked, wanting to know just who this boy was that had caught the attention of his previous student. My name is Rarano Zoro. He said as Mihik pulled out the black blade. I shall remember that. It's been quite some time since I've run into someone with such a strong will. As a courtesy to your strength I shall use my black blade to take your life. Mihik said, showing the sword to Zoro. Thanks. He said simply before moving into attack with his strongest attack, only for Mihik to cut him down and break his other two swords with a black blade. Putting his sacred sword away, he turned to look at Mihik and spread his arms out to the side, baring his chest for the man. What are you doing? Mihik asked in slight surprise. Scars on the back are a swordsman's shame. Zoro said with a smile, and Mihik returned it. Perfect. He found this boy to be what he was looking for as he brought his black blade down Zoro's chest, slicing him open for the whole to see. Luffy had enough coating his arm in hockey. He jumped at his uncle, past friendship or not, he was going to make him pay for hurting one of his nakama. Luffy's fist collided with Mihawk's blade, stopping the rubber boy from moving forward. "Would you kill him, uncle?" Luffy growled out as Mihawk pushed Luffy to the ground looking at him. "Your friend isn't dead," he said, simply allowing Luffy to stand up now that he knew Zoro was alive. "But you don't let people go that challenge you," Luffy stated, knowing his uncle and how he worked well. Luffy before Mihawk could respond to the boy, Luffy's attention was caught onto Zoro, who had been placed into the ship Usopp, and the others had ready to go after Nami. "Zoro," he called to his friend, needing to hear he was really alive. "It's still early for someone like you to die." Mihawk set his attention towards the small ship as well. "My name is Hawkeye Mihawk, and though you are strong, both you and your captain have much to learn. Grow together no matter how many years it will take. I shall hold my title as the greatest swordsman. When the time comes I shall be waiting for you, but until then become stronger, become worthy enough to face me or Rano Zoro." Mihawk then turned to Luffy, looking at him carefully, seeing how the boy had changed from when he was 14. "Do you still carry that same goal after all these years, Luffy?" Mihawk asked, and Luffy nodded. "I will become the Pirate King," he said, and Mihawk smirked at him. "That may be harder to achieve than your friend's goal," he said, and Luffy stuck his tongue out at his uncle. "Who cares, it's my dream and I'll make it real," Luffy said to his uncle, who nodded at the boy captain. "Your family has raised you well, Luffy, you and that boy make a good team. I'll be sure to pass that on to your old man and mother," Mihawk said, having had enough fun for that day and was ready to return to the Grand Line. Luffy looked back towards Zoro, not having heard from him yet, only to see a sword being held up to the sky. "Can you hear me, Luffy?" Zoro choked out, and Luffy shouted back at him, letting him know his voice had been heard loud and clear. "I'm sorry I failed you, as your first mate and right-hand man I can't afford to be this weak." Zoro got out, but he was breathing hard. Luffy felt like smacking him for those words, but let his friend finish. "I swear to you, Luffy, from this day forward I will never lose again," Zoro called out, and Luffy could hear the tears in his voice. "Do you have any problems with that?" Pirate King sighing, then grinning his large smile, Luffy chirped out a nope. Zoro would live, and Mihawk would have a story to worry his ma with, but for now all was going to be okay. Luffy looked off into the distance, knowing his crew would be alright, knowing that Zoro was going to live. "Are you sure that was a good idea, Luffy? Letting your friends leave you all alone to fight here?" Sanji asked, eyeing Luffy as the boy stood tall, his eyes never leaving the direction his friends had gone. "And all I have to do now is kick his ass, right?" Luffy asked Sanji, who nodded. The other chefs out on the deck, watching Luffy carefully, now realizing that Luffy wasn't just all talk, he really was a son of WhiteBeard and apparently the nephew of Hawkeye. "You say that like fighting Don Krieg will be easy, Luffy," Sanji said, blowing some smoke into the air as Luffy laughed, bouncing on his feet ready to fight. "Shishishi, it will be easy, and maybe kinda fun." He gave his large smile before bouncing onto one of the destroyed pieces of ship Uncle Hawkeye had left behind. "Boy dummy. You're lucky to be alive, you know." Luffy yelled up at Krieg, who turned his eyes down towards Luffy, glaring hatefully at him. "I don't want to hear that from a snot-nosed brat like you," he shouted before ordering his men to attack. "Captain, did you see how he talked to that man? Maybe we should get out of here." Someone on Krieg's crew shouted, only to be shot in the chest. "This kid may have guts, but that's why we need that old chef's logbook. If we get a hold of that, it might tell us how to survive in the Grand Line and stand a chance against freaks like this boy and that swordsman. It may also give me information on the Great One Piece as well. That could easily make me the new king of the pirates," Krieg said, his eyes turned down to Luffy, who wasn't smiling at this point in time. Luffy knew he was going to be king, so taking a deep breath he looked at Sanji and put his smile back on his face. "Looks like it's my turn to show what I can do, shitty bastard showing up and ruining people's meals," Sanji said coldly before aiming some well-placed kicks into a few pirates' heads, sending them flying back into the sea. "I'm counting on you, Sanji," Luffy said, his smile threatening to split his face as his eyes turned back and stared right at Krieg. "Right, just don't die, shithead." Sanji pushed his cigarette into a man's head, causing him to scream before getting a kick under the chin. "I won't die," he said happily, not a trace of fear in his voice, before running along the broken pieces of the ship towards Krieg. Krieg, though not very smart, knew now that this brat wasn't as weak as he thought. Sanji was making sure the fins came up along the ship while spending an annoying amount of time having to explain to the others his reasoning. This place is going to become a battlefield, especially with someone like Luffy around. By putting up the fins we can ensure the battle stays out here, keeping the inside safe so that shitty old geezer doesn't complain as much, Sanji said to the chefs, who nodded in understanding. "What was that, you brat?" Zeph said caustically, getting Sanji to not even look at him as he responded with a simple, "You heard me. Sanji, I want you to pay close attention to how Luffy fights." Zeph said, now taking the conversation seriously. "Why is that? Don't we have enough going on right now?" Sanji wanted to just get into protecting his home. "Just do it, brat." Zeph knew people like Luffy didn't ever come into people's lives without a good reason, maybe he could be the one to show Sanji a better chance. "So you come here and try to destroy the place that gave you food. Sorry, but my big brother would be disgraced if I didn't at least try and beat some manners into you." Luffy said, holding onto a piece of mast, but if he had the chance he would have picked his nose. "You think I'm going to let a freak like you anywhere near me? I saw how you talked with that guy before. If you think I'll give you an inch, you're wrong. You who possess one of the legendary devil fruits can no longer swim, isn't that right, kid? Are you sure it's worth having a fight on the waters like this?" Krieg laughed before his shoulder protectors opened up, showing a machine gun behind them, and began to shoot at Luffy. "Is that the best you've got? I've been fighting on the sea since I was little, it's going to take a lot more than water to scare me away," Luffy said, but he put on his smile almost to mock Krieg in Luffy's own special way. Luffy then grabbed the mast of the ship to help pull himself closer, only for Krieg to push Luffy away. This fight wasn't hard for Luffy, in fact it was more annoying than anything, since he wanted to try his haki out but didn't want his friends to be close when he did it. While Luffy was still working on getting close to Krieg, he overheard some chefs with his observation haki, which brought a softer smile to Luffy's face rather than his trademark one. "I've worked at a lot of places and gotten fired from each and every one of them because of my rough ways of living hard," one of the chefs said. "We, after years of wandering, found a place here to call home, so we're not letting you take this place." The other shouted at a group of the pirates who laughed at them along with Krieg. Closing his eyes, Luffy saw Pops laughing, a filled wooden mug in his hands, and the family laughing along with him. Pops had given many of his siblings a place to call home, him as well, so he understood the love these chefs had for this place. The two chefs who had stood up before were beaten by a dinner plate looking guy, allowing the said man to introduce himself to Sanji. Since Krieg really wasn't a threat to him, Luffy chose to watch Sanji to see what he would do. Krieg also seemed interested for whatever reason, so it wasn't a big deal for Luffy to look away, even if he had been trained never to. Sanji and Zeph looked flat out pissed by the plate guy, which caused Luffy to laugh a little at their expressions. It got worse when a smaller pirate went and tried to steal a kitchen knife from the knockdown chef, only to be kicked in the chest by an enraged Sanji for trying. Patching the knife carefully with skills he had learned over the years, he placed it back into his fellow chef's hands and glared at the pirates who dared to try and take it before giving them the ass kicking of their lives. "Once I've filleted you shitty bastards, you'll realize we're not just mere cooks here," Sanji said almost quietly, his eyes overshadowed, creating a demonic look for the gentleman. The giant plate guy scoffed at Sanji, but Sanji pointed his foot at him in response, letting him know that his hands were too precious to be damaged in a simple fight. The plate guy explained himself to Sanji, but it was rather stupid to be honest. If that outfit was to keep him safe, couldn't he have found something that made him look less like a dish? Luffy wasn't paying attention, but really he didn't need to. Krieg had shouted at Luffy before throwing a ball and chain at him that he dodged easily enough because he knew it was coming. Even though Luffy's skills of haki were pretty good, the mast he had let go of was slippery and wet, causing him to lose his footing and fall backwards fast onto the giant plate guy, knocking him over, causing him to bleed. "Luffy!" Sanji yelled, causing Luffy to look at his friend, then look at the plate guy who was beginning to do some weird thing with his hands. "Sorry, did I get in the way?" Luffy asked Sanji, who just shook his head but then looked confused as everyone around was freaking out towards the plate man. "What is that guy doing?" Sanji asked quietly as Luffy began to pick his nose, just staring. "It was just a nosebleed. I mean, if he can't handle a little blood, maybe he shouldn't be a pirate," Luffy said in a dull voice before the guy caught fire. It took a lot for Luffy to stop his cool radar from going off and just watch the man burn, sort of. The guy then shot his flames out more, catching a few others on fire as well. Luffy, having lived with Ace and sharing a room with the Pyro Man for a long time, had gotten used to avoiding flames, but Sanji, who had only used flames in cooking, had not. Using his observation, Luffy knew Sanji wouldn't be fast enough to avoid getting hit by them, so he headbutted his friend in the chest, knocking him off his feet and away from the flames. Unfortunately, saving Sanji had resulted in his pants catching fire, which resulted in Luffy running around trying to smack out the flames that were beginning to burn his rubbery skin. Sanji looked around him as his home began to burn down around him. Luffy, having put his own fire out, breathed a sigh of relief, only to grit his teeth when Sanji decided to charge the plate guy to end the fire and save his home. Luffy cared for his friends above all else in this world, and the idea that Sanji could get injured by an overgrown dinner plate pissed him off. Jumping through the fire following Sanji, he realized that Sanji was so far okay, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to watch and wait. But everyone is afraid of this fire. What's wrong with you people? Plate guy shouted out as Sanji smirked. If I was afraid of fire I would never make it as a chef. He said with pride as Luffy grinned, crossing his arms over his chest. My big brother is fire itself and he told me never to fear the flames. Luffy said as Ace's smile filled up his memory. Sanji didn't waste any time and kicked through the guy's shield, making him bleed some more. What would you like me to do, Sanji? Luffy asked his friend, but Sanji turned his way, brow twitching. I didn't ask you to follow me in here, Luffy. Why aren't you fighting Krieg? Didn't you say you were going to kick his shitty ass? Sanji growled at Luffy, who pouted. I was worried about you, you know. Luffy pouted some more, turning his face slightly away from Sanji, who sighed as Plate guy got back up, rambling on about how he was going to kill them. Plate, who Luffy had learned was really called Pearl, began to shoot fireballs everywhere at the ship, planning on burning it down with everything around it. Sanji looked towards where they were heading with a slightly widened eye, but Luffy didn't know what he should do in this moment. Zeph saw them coming, and with a wave of his peg leg they died out. That was, Luffy said, in awe, looking at the man, a new respect filling his being. Zeph had been a chef who survived paradise and even made it to home. Luffy should have expected the man to know how to handle one of the 6 powers. Pearl seemed to be even more afraid, but that was the least of Luffy's worries right now. The giant spiked ball came flying at Luffy and Sanji, startling the chef for a moment, causing him to freeze up. Oh yeah, I forgot about you, Luffy said, remembering Krieg again and that he needed his ass kicked. Catching the giant weapon, he pushed it back with a Gomu Gomu no Bazooka, then standing protectively in front of Sanji until another piece of the ship fell, giving him away to Krieg. Hurry up and kick his ass, Luffy. What's taking you so long, you shitty bastard? Sanji asked, lifting his new cigarette over one of the flames that surrounded the ship's deck. Yeah right, sorry. Luffy said offhandedly before jumping on the mast and charging Krieg. The ball and chain was swung back at Luffy, but Luffy caught the chain part, pulling the man forward, knocking him off balance. Do you really think you stand a chance, boy? Krieg growled, picking himself back up as Luffy waited for him. All you do is just hide behind your weapons, what a coward. Luffy scowled up at him as Krieg's brow twitched. Once the plate guy had been taken care of, Sanji was mildly surprised to find that Jin had broken Zeph's peg leg, holding him with a gun to his head. Sanji, if you fight anymore I will kill this man. Jin said emotionlessly, his eyes overshadowed and dark. Sanji gritted his teeth, looking at Jin, who was holding back a man he had admired for a better part of his life. In Sanji's pause, Perler, the plate guy in Luffy's mind, had gotten back up and continued to beat on Sanji. Where Luffy was proud of Sanji's loyalty to Zeph and the care he showed for the older man, Luffy really wanted Sanji to fight back. Sanji, fight back. Luffy yelled at his friend as he sat against a wall, his face bleeding from the beating plate guy had given him. I can't, I won't. If I do then Zeph will die. This place is my home and that geezer's life. I've already taken everything important from him. I refuse to take anything else from him ever again. Sanji yelled, standing up only to get smashed in the head by plate guy. Luffy lost it in his anger. He turned towards Krieg, who was laughing and glared hard. It's not time. Zeph yelled, causing Luffy to stop before he did what he wanted to do, as Luffy turned his eyes towards the old chef on the ground that was looking towards him. It's not time, brat, don't let your impatience hinder you. Oh, but Luffy wanted to be impatient and knock each and every one of these people out. Shut up, old man. Jin said to Zeph as Sanji stood back up, everyone shocked that he was able to stand once again. That old man gave everything so that I could be alive today. There's no other way to repay him than for me to risk my life for him. Sanji shouted. Luffy's eyes were blank as he turned towards Krieg. You have 10 minutes, after that I won't hesitate any longer. Luffy said quietly, but Krieg ignored him, so Luffy turned back to stare at Sanji, his countdown beginning. Sending his foot high into the air, Luffy brought it down with a crash, breaking a large part of the deck that was holding the pirates. Luffy, stop. Sanji yelled, but with dark eyes Luffy continued to beat down on the ship. Krieg began to yell at his commander to kill Zeph, but Luffy's dark eyes froze him in slight fear. You now have 7 minutes, so I'd stop freaking out. It's not like I sank this ship or anything, but I think I just might. Luffy said coldly, not really looking at anyone. Stop it, Luffy. This isn't your fight at all. Sanji had never wanted to hit Luffy before, but now he was considering it. I thought we were friends. Those words did hurt, but Luffy knew what he was doing was something his own family would have done if needed to. Sanji, if this place is gone then there won't be any more reason to fight. Luffy looked at things in a simple way. If people were fighting over something, just get rid of what that was, then the fighting would stop. This place saved me. It gave me a home, and I owe my entire life to this place. I won't ever let you take that away from me, Luffy. Sanji yelled, but Zeph smiled, knowing Luffy knew more than any on how Sanji was feeling. Sanji, are you going to die for a stupid place like this? Sanji growled at Luffy, but Luffy wasn't looking away. You know that makes you a bigger idiot than that stupid captain there. He said, talking about Krieg. What did you just say? Sanji shouted, but Luffy wasn't letting go yet. Dying isn't going to repay anyone, you can only do that by living. Luffy shouted and pushed Sanji away, his eyes turning back towards Krieg, who had his arms crossed watching the action. Your time is now 5. Late Guy got back up and began to ramble on about something Luffy wasn't paying attention to until he started to do his fire thingy again. You should just shut up. Luffy said to him, his pupils widening, a wave of anger hitting Pearl, shocking many as he fell to the ground, his eyes rolled back in his head. What was that? Someone shouted as Jin stepped away from Zeph in shock and fear. Krieg, not understanding hockey or ever even knowing what it was, thought it was Jin that did something to Pearl. Jin, you have betrayed your captain and your ship. Krieg shouted, confusing Luffy since it was him who had knocked out Plate Guy, though secretly Luffy was happy he was even able to use his hockey now to just make it work a second time. I know, but I cannot do it, Sanji, this place, they saved us. I can't kill them, not like this. Jin said, accepting that the moment he stepped away from Zeph he was betraying his captain and crew. Make no mistake though, I will be the one to kill Sanji, I just would rather give him the dignity to face death standing up. Jin said, turning to point his weapon at Sanji. Thanks for that, asshole. Sanji said, glaring at Jin. You too, boy, I will be taking your life as well. Jin said, but Luffy laughed. Sorry, but I'm not afraid of you or your stupid crew. Luffy chuckled a bit, his countdown still on in his head. You don't get it, do you, boy? We're the Krieg pirates, rulers of the East Blue. Jin yelled at Luffy, only for him to fully burst out laughing. And I'm Luffy. But it doesn't take much to rule the East Blue. I mean, the only real reason you guys are on top is because you outnumber the others. Numbers may scare others, but not me, I was born from a crew much bigger than yours. Luffy smiled. Luffy, why do you make a habit of pissing off as many people as possible? Sanji sighed, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath of smoke. Really? What do you mean? Jin. You take care of the cook, that brat is all mine. Krieg said. Luffy grinned, but inside he knew time was almost up for this pathetic excuse of a crew. You said I have 5 minutes before, what's my time at now, boy? Krieg said to Luffy. 3. Huh, so that's 3 minutes to kill you, huh? You hear that, Jin? You have 3 minutes to kill that chef. Do I make myself clear? Jin nodded, knowing with such a short time limit like that, he'll have to go all out to do so. Thanks, Luffy. Sanji said sarcastically, not very happy that he's been put on a time limit. I've fought people like you before, boy, those who have the powers of the devil fruits are good only for so long before they are easy to see through. Your trickery won't work on me, brat, you'll have to use more than a little magic to beat me, the ruler of the East Blue. Krieg ranted, but Luffy gave him a straight face in return. I'm tired of your voice, let's end this here and now. Luffy said, leaving Sanji to fight Jin and him to finally end Krieg. Luffy found Krieg to be like a Swiss knife, those knives that had everything in them when opened. First, Krieg pulled out a spiked cape that Luffy had no trouble punching, surprising the man, especially when he saw Luffy's bloodied knuckles. Then when he got back on his feet, Krieg pulled out what appeared to be a battle spear that exploded when it touched things. That would be cool, but it's not. Luffy said, stepping away and holding onto the broken mast stump for support. Now you've done it, kid, no one ever escapes my mighty battle spear. Krieg said in glee as Luffy just looked at it. Krieg brought it down again as Luffy caught it in his hands, allowing it to explode. So if I touch there, Luffy thought out loud, an idea coming to his mind as he continued to punch the spear, taking the explosions each time. Krieg laughed as a little blood fell from the places it had hit, only to finally get a look at what had happened to his spear. Now that your toy's broken, you're nothing. Without its blade part, it's just like a stupid bomb on a stick, and let's face it, that's pretty boring. Luffy said, scratches on him, but nothing significant. You think so, huh? He then brought out more weapons, which Luffy smiled, accepting the challenge for now. Sanji and Jin's fight had been as well matched as ever. People kept saying Jin was heartless, but proved he did have a heart toward Sanji after giving the chef a good beating. Jin's tears showed that even the coldest of hearts can be melted by the act of kindness. I can't, Sanji saved my life. I can't kill him, I'm so sorry, Captain. Jin cried out. Luffy felt a notch of pity for the man who stood over a bloodied Sanji. Jin, Luffy whispered as Krieg began to yell at him. Sanji treated me like a normal person with decency and respect, how can I kill someone who saved my life? Jin cried, tears flowing down his face as memories passed through his eyes. Please, can't we just leave these people alone, just this once? Jin asked through his tears, which only set Krieg into a rage. Do you truly think you can disobey me and then tell me what to do? You are dismissed from being my combat commander, you weakling. Pirates, move out of the way. He opened up his armor on his hand, preparing something, as the pirates around began to scramble, screaming about poison. Luffy gave Jin a sad look before turning towards Krieg. Taking a deep breath, he tried to picture himself as Marco facing down a powerful foe threatening his family. Time's up. Luffy said, a memory of so long ago filling his heart as he let the shadows over his eyes fade. Krieg just looked at Luffy in confusion once again. What was that? Krieg screamed while Luffy remembered something his ma had once said to a group of pirates before giving them the beating of their lives. I gave you time to surrender, now you can go to hell, or something like that. Luffy said, copying something that had once stuck with him after that terrible day. You're nothing but a stupid brat who's in over his head, now die boy. Krieg said, putting a gas mask over his face as many started to do the same thing. Boy, old man, was I patient enough this time? Luffy asked, not bothering to turn around as Zeph laughed loudly at those words. Just do it, you damn brat. That was all Luffy needed to hear as he turned and glared at Krieg, letting all of his anger and frustration slip through his will, causing a wave of power to overflow, attacking all those weaker than himself. Krieg hadn't been expecting the hockey to hit him at all, but even though he was weak, he still had the strong desire to take the restaurant, which kept him more awake than his crew was. You who hides behind your crew and cheap tricks doesn't deserve to sail on these seas. Even if you do make it to paradise, there are people there way stronger than you, and even stronger than me. You can rule the East Blue for all I care, but never forget that this sea is the weakest for a reason. Luffy said to Krieg, who was trying not to lose consciousness and failing. Sanji felt his body shake as he looked at his hands, trying to stop them from trembling. What just happened? His cigarette had fallen out of his mouth, his eyes turning towards Luffy, who stood there before jumping down on the wooden pieces heading towards him. That was something known as Conqueror's Haki. Very few have it, and even fewer ever are able to use it. Zeph said, moving to stand beside Sanji was sitting on the broken deck as Luffy tried not to fall into the water. Luffy is able to. Sanji looked around, his eyes falling on Jin, who had passed out as well from the wave of Haki. I'm glad he's on our side, because people like Luffy are hell to fight, they will fight until they either win or are dead. Zeph said to Sanji, who stared at the now clumsy boy in wonder and even amazement. Luffy was excited to get to Sanji, but was pulled back when a metal net caught around him, dragging him backwards. Luffy was so excited that he had won and was able to successfully use his haki that he let his guard down and his observation slip. This isn't over yet, boy. If Luffy had the moment, he would have been surprised that Krieg had managed to pull himself back together after his haki. I'm not strong enough yet. He thought out loud, struggling to get out of the tangled mess of netting. His haki was good enough to knock out weaker people and many of the surrounding chefs, but it wasn't strong enough to take out everyone. Maybe it was because he had used it already on that plate guy earlier. Krieg spun Luffy around and around, laughing as Luffy was finally able to free his arms and legs through some of the holes in the netting. Smiling to himself, Luffy stretched his arms and grabbed Krieg by his shoulders, allowing himself to be wound up tight, then unspun himself, along with Krieg, into the air, bringing him down hard, breaking his armor on the rubble. Sanji, I need some help. Luffy asked as he fell into the water. You might want to follow through with that request, as you may know devil fruit users cannot swim. Zeph said to a dazed Sanji, when quickly swore and dove into the water to save Luffy from a sad death. Looking for Luffy wasn't easy because of the sunken ship's pieces surrounding him. When he did find Luffy, he almost let out his breath in relief. Pulling Luffy from the netting, he carried the boy up to the surface, but along the way his mind wandered to the way Luffy fought and also to the way that swordsman Zoro fought. Both had stood up for their dreams, willing to do whatever it took to achieve them, even die for them. Hey Luffy, don't you dare die. I promised your stupid brother I would watch over you, and I really don't need him causing trouble here. Sanji said, thinking of Ace and how troublesome he could be if Luffy was in any trouble, mild or not. Sanji almost had a panic attack when Luffy hadn't woken up. The idea of Ace's flames beginning to scare him. He was shaking Luffy only to find he was taking a deserved nap. You moron, scaring me like that. Sanji said in annoyance, but fondness in his voice as well. Jin had woken from Luffy's haki and stared down at his defeated captain. Walking past the pirates that had woken, he grabbed his unconscious captain and threw him over his shoulder. Everyone, we have lost. We should leave now while we even have a bit of dignity left for us. Jin said, and many who would have protested fell silent, getting up quickly to obey Jin. Hey Sanji, thanks for everything. I know you don't owe me anything at all, but when that kid gets up, can you tell him something for me? Jin asked Sanji, who didn't say a word. Tell him I'll see him in paradise. Jin used the word Luffy had called the Grand Line, which brought a smile to Sanji's face. Sure, now get out of here and don't come back. Sanji said, shaking his head at the man, but turned toward some of the chefs. Go and grab him that small boat we sometimes use. He yelled only to get protests in response, but his look of anger that promised pain caused them to move into action quite quickly. Jin stood before the small boat that had everyone on it, but his eyes turned down to Luffy, who was snoring away happily. In Jin's eyes there was a new spark of fondness that many across the great seas shared for Luffy. Meat, more meat, Luffy mumbled in his sleep. Sanji smiled, his hair covering both his eyes now. I graciously accept this boat. I'm to take it that you don't want it back? Jin asked, but he knew the answer. Yeah, you can keep it, but don't ever come back here for anything at all. Sanji said, once again making sure that Jin knew he was no longer welcomed in this place. Jin sailed away, leaving a mess that needed to be cleaned up, but Sanji was happy it was just all over now. Why don't you take him up to your room and let him rest? Zeph said, coming up behind them. Sanji looked up at the old man. What about cleaning up? He asked, but Zeph laughed. I've got plenty of people for that, and you're the most injured next to this kid. If I let him go back out there all damaged like that, his family will have all of our heads. Zeph laughed at the thought of having WhiteBeard show up. Right, I'll leave this place to you then. Sanji lifted Luffy up, surprised on how light the kid was. I'll have to make you a good meal for fighting so hard. When Luffy woke up he was surprised to be in Sanji's room. Oh, so you're awake. Sanji was leaning on the doorframe as Luffy sat up, yawning. Man, I'm Dottie began, but Sanji held up a hand. Hungry, I know. Dinner's down in the kitchen waiting for you, but you're probably in a hurry. Sanji said, but Luffy was no longer listening since food had been mentioned. Food? He shouted, running past Sanji, who smiled, knowing full well Luffy couldn't concentrate on an empty stomach. When Luffy got to the kitchen he found the chefs had made him a great meal, but no one else was eating. Hey kid, there's something else I need you to do. Zeph had said, suddenly breaking the silence everyone was causing. Luffy said, but didn't look up from his meal. I want you to take Sanji with you on your trip. Luffy stopped eating now to give Zeph his full attention. He's been chained to this place for too long. If he goes with you, he will have the freedom to achieve his dream and find out the world is bigger than he could ever imagine. Zeph said to Luffy, who put his fork down on the table carefully. Nope. Luffy said, causing many of the chefs to drop their jaws at his single word. But you said they had begun, but Luffy shook his head. I'm no kidnapper. If Sanji doesn't want to come, that's his choice. Luffy wanted Sanji on his crew, but there was no way he was ever going to force someone to be there if they didn't want to. Sanji was standing outside the room listening, his head down and eyes overshadowed. He knew that Zeph was just trying to help him out, but he owed his life to this place. Could he really leave it behind him? Sanji walked away, not wanting to hear any more of what was being said. He had a lot of thinking he needed to do. After his meal, Luffy ignored the chef's pleas for him to take Sanji by bursting from the room and wandering around a little. He knew he had to go soon since Nami was waiting for him and his crew needed their captain, but he wanted to at least say goodbye to Sanji first. Finding Sanji wasn't that hard. The restaurant was a big ship, but not bigger than the one he had been raised on. Luffy? Sanji said once Luffy had found him, but the blonde didn't turn around from staring out at the sea. Hey. Luffy climbed up on the railing beside him, looking at the water as well. A moment of silence fell between them. Sanji, do you still think of the all blue? Luffy asked, catching Sanji off guard. Every day. How old were you the last time you were here? Sanji asked him, eyes still set towards the sea. I was 14 going on 15. Luffy said, thinking about it for a moment. We've changed since then, haven't we? But Luffy wasn't sure he really had. Maybe, I dunno. He didn't like to stop and think about that stuff for long. You were the first person to not laugh at my dream, you know. Sanji said, a small smile gracing his face now. I don't laugh at dreams. That was the honest truth. Luffy would never laugh at someone's important dream. Luffy stood up. This was as good of a goodbye he was going to give to anyone. Luffy. Sanji had stood up as well, looking in the boy's direction now as Luffy looked back. Zeph was standing above the balcony looking down at the scene in wonder, hoping this kid had what it took to change his eggplant's heart. Your dream is crazy, becoming the Pirate King won't be easy. Then again though, my dream sounds pretty crazy as well, Sanji said as Luffy fully turned himself around to look at him fully. Sanji? He asked, wanting to know what was going on. For the sake of my dream I will follow you on this trip to becoming the Pirate King, if you still want me, that is. Sanji said as Luffy's eyes widened and his smile grew. Of course I do. Luffy shouted, happy to have Sanji ready to follow him just as he had planned years ago. Zeph left the scene to prepare a small ship for his brat, filling it with stuff he may need to survive on these waters. Luffy was talking with a bunch of chefs while Sanji was packing his things in his room. Looking around his room, Sanji felt a tad bit sentimental. He was saying goodbye to a place that had given him life and happiness for so many years. Picking up a picture on his desk, he saw himself and Zeph when the restaurant was first established, and he smiled. Stepping out of the room, he looked back one more time, accepting now that his journey was about to begin. He closed the door, walking away. On the main deck, Sanji saw Luffy now in a boat with the two guys he vaguely remembered to be friends with that green-haired idiot. So you're finally leaving, Brad? Zeph said from behind. Sanji, who had managed to hold himself back for so long, couldn't stop his heart from breaking at this moment. Take care of yourself. Zeph as well was holding back his own emotions. He had waited a long time for Sanji to want to go off on his own, but now that the day was here, it was harder than he had expected it to be. Turning around, Zeph was surprised to find Sanji bowing his head towards him and the other chefs present. Thank you for taking damn good care of me all these years. He cried out, which broke Zeph's resolve as he cried as well. Outgoing brat. He said, his voice shaking, but strong all at once. Sanji Luffy couldn't wait any longer, but Sanji stared up at Zeph. Even now their bond as strong as ever. Once he had said his silent goodbye, Sanji stood and followed Luffy to the small ship that began to set sail. Waving goodbye with Luffy, Sanji couldn't wait to see how this journey would play out, but more than anything he couldn't wait to see that beautiful Nami swan again. Luffy sat down and rested for a moment as Johnny and Yusaku took control of the sails, knowing where they had to go next. Nami, just wait, I'm coming. Nami was staring at the waters as the sails took her towards her home island. Her heart was beating fast in her chest, knowing what awaited her back home. While she was worried about reaching her home and seeing the man who had haunted her life for many years, she worried about the boy with the straw hat she had left behind her. Luffy was strong, she knew that, but she still worried that his carefree nature could be a little too much sometimes. She also feared that he didn't take his fight seriously enough and that could become a problem for him. Overconfidence kills the fools who think they're invincible, so she knew that Luffy was strong enough once again for the people here on this ocean, but Arlong was a different type of strong. Luffy, please be safe, she whispered to the wind, hoping for it to be true that he would be safe against the opponent that he was facing, so he could come after her soon. Elamir, it's almost over. Luffy was on that small boat with Sanji and one of the two friends that used to follow Zoro. You guys don't seem to understand just how scary this guy is going to be, do you? Yusaku asked. Johnny had gone with Usopp and Zoro to show them the way, while Yusaku stayed to lead Luffy and the cook as soon as possible. Does it really matter? Anyone who threatens a beautiful lady deserves an ass kicking. Sanji said, bringing up plates of food for Luffy to eat, hoping to get the teenager as much energy in him as possible to fight again. But you guys don't understand. This guy just isn't anyone, he's Arlong, a fisherman from the Grand Line. Yusaku yelled at them, but Luffy shook his head, not caring. Arlong? Luffy tried to think back and remember if he had ever met anyone named Arlong. He's scary strong, maybe even for you, brother Luffy. He said, but Luffy was still trying very hard now to think. His cheeks were beginning to turn red from the effort. Stop thinking so hard and eat, shithead. Sanji said, slapping the boy, who bounced a bit at the impact before grinning and stuffing his face. No matter who it is, we'll fight them. Sanji placed a plate in front of Yusaku as well, who screamed that he was still too worried to eat right now. You guys need to be more careful, fishmen are on a whole other level than us human beings. Yusaku said while eating, since Sanji had reminded him that the food was not to be wasted. You know, Luffy began with food in his mouth, most don't like it when you talk about them like that. He finished his mouthful, swallowing it and giving Yusaku a look. So you boys really don't know who Arlong is? He asked them as both shook their heads, meaning no. How the hell don't you guys know about someone like him? As much as he liked Sanji and Luffy, their naivety on this crazy man was too much for him to handle. I'm not from the East Blue, so I never really had to worry about pirates here. Luffy said, raising his hand up and smiling. They never bothered our restaurant, so I didn't really care either. Sanji admitted, causing the man to drop his head at them, worrying about their sanity. Then it's time I gave you boys a lesson on who you're going up against. He said to them as Luffy nodded, glad to get some information on his next opponent. Arlong is a man who would destroy anything in his path all over the Grand Line. He started as Luffy scrunched up his face a bit, really trying to think if he knew the man. He can't be that strong then, I mean I don't know of him and I was raised on the Grand Line. Fishman, you know, I've heard that the females on that island are some of the most beautiful creatures in the world. Sanji said, hearts forming in his eyes while thinking about it. The mermaids? Yeah, I guess they're nice. Luffy said as Sanji turned his head quickly towards Luffy. You've seen such beauty and have never told me. He grabbed Luffy by the shirt and shook him, but Luffy looked away annoyed. It's not that big a deal, really, he said as Yusaku coughed, getting their attention back. The reason they call the Grand Line the Pirates' Graveyard is because of Arlong and the other powers that rule over it. The first of the powers is the warlords. Those guys are pirates authorized by the government. He said, and Luffy frowned. He knew of the other emperors like Shanks and his pops, but Ma hadn't told him about the warlords. These guys can do as they want as long as they help out the government. The government gives them protection as long as they come when they're called. These guys are strong though, they didn't get to where they are if they weren't. The guy who beat Big Bro Zoro was also one of them. At those words, Luffy's eyes widened. His uncle was a warlord and hadn't ever told him. When he saw his uncle again he was going to kick his ass or let Zoro do it, it was more whoever got to him first. The warlord that we need to focus on right now is a pirate named Jinbei. He continued as Luffy was already freaking out about Uncle Hawkeye not telling him, but now Jinbei as well. What about him? Luffy said in a quiet voice, annoyance hidden behind his cheer. He's the strongest fishman among the warlords, causing as much destruction throughout the Grand Line as Arlong has. He continued on, but Luffy frowned. Jinbei was a pirate, he knew that, but the whole super destruction thingy didn't sound like him much. It said that Jinbei let Arlong loose on the East Blue so that he could have a position within the warlords. Since then Arlong has taken control of around 20 islands, his power surpasses people as strong as even Don Krieg. He shouted at them, but Luffy wasn't happy with this. Why then would Nami want anything to do with this guy? Sanji asked, but Yusaku shook his head. She wants his bounty, I suppose. Haven't you idiots heard anything I've said though? Fishmen are dangerous. He shouted at them as Luffy stood up and looked out towards the sea in the direction of his home. Jinbei's not a bad man. He said, catching the attention of the two in the boat. Luffy? Sanji was curious, knowing Luffy had probably met a few big names being on his pop's ship. He let Arlong loose here. He has to be a bad guy. Yusaku said, but Luffy shook his head. I don't know Jinbei and Arlong's past, but what I do know is Jinbei is like one of my brothers. This stunned Yusaku that Luffy was talking about a warlord like this, let alone a fishman. How about I tell you guys how we met and you can decide from there? Luffy said with a big grin, and Sanji nodded, standing up. I'll prepare more food, it'll be a little while before we reach Nami Swan. Sanji said, letting Luffy jump around in excitement for a good story and some good food. You've really met Jinbei? Yusaku asked Luffy, who nodded his head excitedly. Yeah, quite a few times really. Jinbei isn't the only fishman brother I have, Namor has helped me out so many times I can't even count them anymore. Luffy laughed, now missing his brothers once again. When Sanji returned a short while later he had plates of food for everyone, and once he had handed them all out he sat down, giving Luffy a nod, letting him know he could start. My story starts. Luffy age 10. Luffy was bouncing all around the Moby Dick, excitement buzzed through his entire being. What's wrong with him? Sabo asked Marco, who was waiting patiently for Luffy to get over his excitement, but he should know better than that. We're on our way to Fishman Island, Yoi. Marco knew they had a little ways to go before they reached the place to coat their ship. Fishman Island? Sabo asked, catching Ace's attention. That's right, you boys only briefly saw the island years ago. Thatch had come up beside them as well, picking Sabo up and sitting him on the railing. Why didn't we stop last time? Ace asked, because he remembered going under the water, but not actually stopping long enough to look around. Because as much as we wanted to, the Marines get really anxious when we're in the first half for so long. We wanted to make sure you boys were able to handle the weather changes before moving further in. Us taking so long to get back to the new world made Marines jumpy and the government watchful. We didn't want to stay long just in case something happened. Thatch said to Ace, putting him beside Sabo even if the boy complained about being picked up. But we're going now, right? Luffy asked, still bouncing on the balls of his feet. Yeah, we'll be making a stop there this time for sure, Yoi. Marco knew Luffy really wanted the candy Fishman Island was famous for. Why are we going? Ace was curious. Because Pops is meeting with one of our allies. Thatch smiled, excited to see his old friend again. Allies? Sabo asked. Man, we have a lot of people here in this family, and some of them are sailing on their own ships protecting Pop's territories. Fishman Island is under Pop's protection, so our good friend Jinbei will be meeting us there, even if he doesn't like returning to that place too often. Thatch said, laughing a little at Jinbei's reluctance on returning to his home island. Why doesn't he like coming home? Luffy asked, this time never meeting this man before, so he was interested. Because he doesn't want his reputation as a pirate to cause problems for the people, Yoi. Marco said with a small smile. But he's friends with Pops. Luffy asked, carefully, needing to know if he had another sibling or not. Yes, he's good friends with Pops, Yoi. Marco smiled, and Luffy gave his small laugh. Then he's friends with me. The trip to the island to get their ship coated was fairly quick since they had traveled this way many times before and knew what current would get them there faster. I'm hungry, are we there yet? Luffy pouted, leaning on the railing as many chuckled, passing by. You know we aren't, Luffy, be patient. Thatch said, passing a plate of warm cookies to the boy, who brightened up on the sight and smell of fresh treats. You're the best brother ever. Luffy said through mouthfuls. I'll need that in writing, Luffy. Thatch said with a grin, but you could almost see the question mark over the raven-haired kid's head. Why? But Thatch shook his head, laughing at his own joke. Never mind, brat, make sure to share those with your vultures, I mean brothers. He pointed his thumb back towards Ace and Sabo, who were following the smell of the cookies Luffy had. Pops was smiling down at his youngest as they fought over the cookies, happy to see them so cheerful. Fishman Island should be a new adventure for those boys. Aizu had come over to check on his father and youngest siblings. Luffy has experienced it before, so it will be his job to show his brothers around. Pops was giving Luffy some responsibility and a chance to take the lead from his older brothers. "Will Marco be going with you to see Jinbei?" he asked, but Pops chuckled knowing that even though he was giving Luffy the responsibility, Marco would be following his every step while on that island. "I see, it might be a nice idea to introduce the brats to Jinbei, he might like them." Jinbei was a good fisherman who cared for his people dearly. Luffy would like the man that was guaranteed. "Ops, we're here Yoi." Marco called from up above, a small smile on his lazy face. "So how does the coding work?" Sabo asked curiously as Aizu smiled, leading the boy away to explain exactly what was going on. "So we'll be going soon?" Luffy asked Pops, that smiled and nodded down at the boy that then jumped around in excitement. "I can't wait." Luffy cheered and ran off. Once the ship was coded and ready to go, the crew set off for Fishman Island. Marco smiled at the little pile of sleeping kids on the main deck. They tired themselves out with all that excitement. Thatch smiled, shaking his head. "It's good, let them rest so they have enough energy for when we get there Yoi." Luffy still enjoyed naps, especially when there was nothing to do. Ace was prone to narcoleptic fits throughout the day, so all members were prepared for one of those at all times. Sabo was more of the silent type that chose to read while his brothers napped. "We'll wake them when we get there," Thatch said, leaving the boys alone, Marco joining him because as much as he loved his brats, he too enjoyed the peace and quiet he got when they were sleeping. Luffy yawned and stretched, pushing Ace off of him, letting his head hit the deck hard. "Luffy, I swear," he growled out, rubbing the sore spot, but his eyes widened when he saw the view around him. "We're here." Luffy cheered happily, jumping up, completely awake now. "Sabo, wake up." Ace pushed his brother a bit, letting the blonde slowly yawn and rub the sleep out of his eyes. "Why's Lu yelling?" he asked before Ace just pointed with a smile. "We're here." At a docking area on Fishman Island, a blue fishman was waiting, his arms crossed, a look of worry on his face. Pop saw the man and stood up, letting his sons know what was happening. "Jinbei," Pop said with a smile as the man nodded in Pop's direction, a smile on his own face. "Old man, it's been a while." He greeted as Luffy ran off the ship towards him. Jinbei stared down at the small child, surprise on his face. He had heard they had a brat on board, but didn't think he'd actually be that young. "Who are you?" Luffy asked in excitement, his head tilted back so he could look up at the tall man. "My name is Jinbei," he said, and Luffy giggled. "I'm Luffy. Nice to meet ya." "Ah. These guys are Ace and Sabo." Luffy pointed to his brothers who were walking off the ship and standing on either end of Luffy protectively. "I see," he said as Ace glared at the man, his arms crossed, letting him know silently that if anything happened to Luffy, there'd be big trouble. "I didn't know you brought brats so young onto your ship," Jinbei said, but he couldn't remove his eyes from the cold ones Ace was giving him. The look was too harsh on a boy so young. "These guys aren't just brats, Jinbei, they're our brothers." Thatch had come beside Ace, putting a strong hand on the boy's shoulder, letting him know it was safe for him to relax. "I have some news for you," Jinbei started, but Pops put his hand up to stop him. "News can wait, why don't we show the children around?" he asked as Jinbei was startled while Luffy jumped and grabbed the fishman's hand. "Show me around some more. I've only seen a few places so I need to see more." Luffy cheered as Jinbei looked down at the boy in wonder as Pops and many others surrounding them smiled, knowing the feeling he had right now. "You're old man and I need some time to talk, Luffy-kun," Jinbei said, but Pops laughed. "Take the boys around, show them your home, Jinbei. You know where to find me when you return," he said, leaving Jinbei no room to argue. "You don't want to show us around?" Luffy looked up at the man with big watering brown eyes, and before Jinbei had the heart to say no, Marco swooped in, grabbing the boy around the middle, picking him up. "He'd love to show you around, mind if I come as well, Yoi?" Marco asked Luffy, who wrapped his arms around Marco's neck in happiness. "Man, sounds like an adventure," Luffy chirped. Ace and Sabo sighed, knowing that Jinbei almost fell into Luffy's strongest attack. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Jinbei asked the boys, but only Sabo smiled. "Luffy's puppy dog eyes have gotten a lot of strong men to do weird things. Marco might have just saved you from some worse fate than showing us around," Sabo said as Jinbei looked at Marco, who was hugging Luffy tightly. "I've never seen the commander look like that before," he said softly in awe. "Trust me, it's a look we're quite used to now," Thatch said, which caused Jinbei to become interested in this child that had won over the hearts of a notorious pirate crew. Walking around the island with Thatch, Marco, and the brats was in a weird way fun for the fisherman. Luffy was interested in anything that had to do with food or fun. Sabo wanted to know the history of the place as often as possible, but Ace was more interested in just looking around, silently catching the eyes of a few mermaids men and fishmen before they turned away quickly. "Nah, why are they acting weird?" Ace asked. He was walking beside Thatch, and Jinbei frowned slightly. Because in the world there's a rift between the fishmen and the humans. Thatch whispered quietly, but was feeling a bit sad because he had hoped with Pops being around that might have mellowed out a bit. They're not used to seeing human children, mostly pirate crews pass through here and they rarely carry children on board. Jinbei said to them, but only Ace and Sabo were listening. Luffy had smelled something super fantastic and chose to follow his nose rather than stay with the group. Letting his nose take him to the wonderful smell. Luffy didn't realize he was being followed by some weird fishmen. Jinbei had noticed Luffy's absence and waited for Marco or Thatch to become aware of it as well. Marco was in a deep conversation with Sabo while Ace was getting a rundown on the history between fishmen and humans. Jinbei realized in his own way that if they noticed Luffy was gone, a panic might break out, so sneaking away Jinbei began his own search for the little straw-hatted boy. Meat, meat. Luffy cheered, climbing up on a stool, drooling at the smell that was coming from behind the counter. Right up. The guy said. His eyes lingered on Luffy for a second too long, but Luffy didn't take notice. He just wanted his food. What's a human brat doing here all alone? Some guy said, causing Luffy to turn and look at him, giving a blank face. Kids your age shouldn't wander off, he said, taking a few steps closer to Luffy, his smile growing slicker each moment. Because if they do, people like me will take them away. He shouted, aiming to grab Luffy, but the boy aimed his fist and punched him in the face. Why you brat? The man shouted as Luffy jumped from table to table, avoiding being caught by the guy. When I catch you, I'm going to drag you up to Sabati and sell you for a decent price. He shouted as Luffy laughed, jumping once again away from the man. Is that really what you're going to do? A voice that Luffy had just come to like asked, causing the little boy to jump into the man's arms. Wire, Jinbei. The man said. Luffy laughed a little as Jinbei looked at the man. This brat would cause you more problems than you'd like if you managed to sell him. Jinbei said, not looking away. Why, he's just a stupid human brat. The man shouted, pointing his finger at Jinbei, who laughed. Brat he might be, but he's one of WhiteBeard's brats. Do you really think you have the strength to stand up to his old man? Luffy just smiled. He was proud that he was able to actually hit someone with his punches. Maybe he was getting better after all. DCH, that brat isn't worth it, he scowled, beginning to walk past Luffy, but stopped for a moment. I'll remember this brat. Someday when you come back here I'll make you pay. I'll make all humans pay. Then he continued to walk out the door. Luffy grabbed onto Jinbei's clothes tightly, but the man patted him on the head. And that guy is supposed to be one of the king's guards. What is Neptune thinking keeping Hody around with that attitude? Jinbei scowled, but then looked down at Luffy, who had big white innocent eyes. You came here for some food, right? Then let's grab some and go. Your brothers are probably worried by now. Luffy nodded his head, but his admiration for Jinbei had just risen to Nakama level. Once he had his food and he had calmed down, they walked back towards the ship where the old man was. Luffy held Jinbei's hand the entire time, refusing to let the man go, which Jinbei found was rather interesting, but also charming. When they got back to the ship, Marco and the others were there, looking worried, but seemed to be okay. Luffy? Ace yelled, anger in his voice as all eyes turned towards the boy who was holding tightly onto Jinbei. Luffy, why did you wander off? You know it's not always safe, Yui. Marco scolded, but Jinbei held up a hand. We just wanted to have a small snack. There is no reason to worry, Marco. He said as the man sighed, looking down towards Luffy. I swear you like to worry us all, don't you, Yui? Marco asked, but Luffy had his eyes on Jinbei now. All is well? Pops asked a fisherman who nodded, patting Luffy on the head. Big Ma'am has been sending people towards this island on a frequent basis. I am not sure what she wants, but it's a good idea to keep an eye on this island just in case. Jinbei said, relaying the message he got to the old man. I see, we'll keep a better eye here, but even that woman should know to stay away from my territories. I shall send her a polite warning. Pop said as a few of the members chuckled at the polite warning bit. That is all I have to report. If there is anything else I shall come straight to you. Jinbei said, and they nodded, now ready to enjoy their time on this island before returning back to the new world. Everyone began to move back towards the deck, but Luffy stayed put, a look on his face no one had ever seen before. The Jinbei Luffy began all waited to see what he was going to do before a large smile broke out on his face, even though the seriousness was still in his eyes. Join my crew. Many eyes widened at those words, even Pops was caught off guard. Luffy, a few people whispered softly, but Jinbei looked down at the kid, looking really hard at him to see if he was serious or not. You're what, 7, brat? Jinbei asked as Luffy smirked. I'm 10. He clarified, and Jinbei nodded. You have plenty of time to grow then, kid. He said, and Luffy frowned slightly. No one moved while the serious air surrounded their youngest brother. Are you saying no? He needed that answer clear. I'm saying that once you've grown up more I'll consider your offer, Luffy-kun, but for now not yet. Your old man protects this place and I shall help him in any ways I can. Jinbei needed Luffy to grow and experience the world before he was ready to have anyone on his crew. So someday, right? Jinbei nodded, knowing that might be as close to a no as he could ever get. Then someday, Jinbei, you will join my crew. Luffy said, forming a bond in his mind before running back onto the ship looking for more food. You have an interesting family, old man. Jinbei said, but even he had been won over by the child. I wouldn't have it any other way. Marco and Thatch looked in the direction Luffy had run, but a weird feeling was in their chests. Luffy wasn't acting like the boy they knew and loved, he was acting like a captain would. They could see a grown man asking another of equal strength to follow him in the way Luffy stood his ground and spoke to Jinbei. He's growing up fast, Thatch whispered to Marco, because Ace and Sabo had decided to follow their little brother in search of a snack. If he does get Jinbei, he'll become quite the force to be reckoned with, Yoi. Marco smiled. I have a feeling he'll be that with or without Jinbei. Come on, let's go stop our brats before they eat all our supplies. Thatch said as Marco followed behind him, smiling because he rather liked the idea of Luffy becoming strong enough to ask someone like Jinbei to be one of his nakama and could only hope he got to that strength. That was so beautiful. Yusaku cried out, wiping his eyes with his sleeves. Jinbei must be a good guy if you asked him to join, Sanji said, taking in a puff of smoke. He is, and that's why I don't think him and Arlong are working together, it's not like him to do stuff like that. Luffy smiled, hoping to see his old friend again someday. Looks like we're almost there, Luffy said, seeing an island up ahead. Then let the fun begin. Boy. I think that's the Mary. Usopp shouted, looking in the distance, hoping beyond hope that he was right. The closer they got, the better Usopp could make out the wonderful shape of his beloved ship. We actually caught up with her, Johnny said in surprise, but a small smile was beginning to form on his face. Zoro, we're almost to Nami, so hold on a bit longer. Usopp said to the swordsman, who was actually sleeping, trying not to think about his injuries. Nami was leaning on the railing of the Going Merry when she heard a voice she didn't expect to hear. Usopp? She asked, looking around, finally seeing a small boat with a long-nosed sniper waving frantically at her. Usopp? She yelled, running to the helm and turning the ship slightly to meet up with the sniper. Nami, we finally caught up to you. I didn't actually think we would. Usopp said in delight, almost wanting to hug the girl in relief, but valued his life a little bit. Where's Luffy? She looked around, not seeing her captain, but her eyes landed on Zoro and widened. Zoro? What happened? She helped Usopp and Johnny get Zoro onto the ship carefully. Luffy's fighting Krieg. Johnny said to her once Zoro was in a steady position. Usopp, go grab the first aid kit quickly. She shouted, and the sniper saluted her before running off. He's fighting Don Krieg and you guys just left him there? She was shouting and removing Zoro's shirt, at the same time freezing when she saw the injury. How is he still alive? She whispered as Usopp returned with the first aid. He said he could handle it, so I trust brother Luffy. Johnny said, hoping Luffy was stronger than he sometimes looked. I hope you're right. But she knew it would take a lot to take out Luffy. Cleaning Zoro's injury and stitching it up as best as she could before applying some ointment and fresh bandages, she sighed. As long as he doesn't go running into another fight, he'll be fine until we can get him to a proper doctor. Nami sighed as Johnny and Usopp moved Zoro to a bed inside the Mary. Once they had returned, they looked at Nami, who was frowning, her eyes looked tired and sad. What's the plan, Nami? Should we wait somewhere for Luffy to catch up? Usopp asked, but Nami shook her head. If I'm away too much longer, Arlong will start to think things. In a nearby village I have a sister who can help you out for now. I have to go to Arlong, once Luffy gets here we'll come up with a plan together. Nami said as they got closer to the island. What's your sister's name so we know how to find her? Usopp asked and Johnny nodded excitedly. Knowing her, she'll find you first. Nami smiled, dropping at knowing her sister's personality well. Whatever happens though, please don't confront Arlong until Luffy arrives. She asked as Usopp nodded, having no intention of going up against a fishman if he didn't have to. Sighing, but taking them at their word, Nami pointed to the closest beach, saying they were to drop anchor there. Luffy will be here soon, I promise. Usopp said to her comfortingly, and she nodded. Follow this trail and it will take you to my home village, but be careful, she said, throwing her backpack over her shoulder and walking away from the Mary and her friends. Zoro should be fine resting here, right? Usopp asked Johnny, who nodded, thinking Zoro was too injured to move. Should be, it'll probably be better for him to rest as much as possible. Johnny said, worried for his friend. Luffy will hopefully be here soon, so let's go check out the village and see if we can find Nami's sister. Usopp suggested, and Johnny nodded, following Usopp along the trail to unwanted and unknowing danger. Zoro woke up a few hours later, yawning and needing a good drink. The Mary? He asked, looking around, sleep still in his eyes as he took in the ship. When did we catch up to the witch? He asked, looking at the island in front of him and smirking, placing a hand on his chest to feel the injury he received. He stopped in slight shock. That damn woman, he said, the smirk still in place as he fingered the bandages, feeling them carefully. I'll be paying out of my ass for these stupid bandages. He was still grateful for them though. He knew Usopp hadn't done them because he had proven he knew only a bit of medical knowledge, while Nami had proven she knew quite a lot back with Johnny and Yusaku. Which way to the village? He asked himself before walking along the trail and making a sharp left into the trees. X. Luffy was jumping around the small boat in excitement because he could see the island up ahead. We're here. He shouted, ready to get into whatever was next for him. He had promised Nami he would help her, so he would. Sanji was cleaning up the dishes from their meal when he felt the boat stop rocking slightly, meaning Luffy had stopped moving. What's wrong? He asked, knowing Luffy couldn't sit still for very long. It's been a while since I've seen a Sea King like this, he said, looking at the cow that had appeared next to them. Luffy wasn't afraid of Sea Kings, he actually found them quite fun to bother and then eat later on. What is that monster? Yusaku shouted and pointed, but Luffy smiled. That's lunch. He was drooling again, thinking of the good meat this big fish could bring. Like hell it is, you just ate, shithead. Sanji said. He had a few dishes in his hands as the Sea King looked towards him. You wanted some of this lunch? Sanji asked the monster that nodded its big head before opening its mouth trying to eat Sanji whole. Then show up earlier next time, you shitty fish. He shouted at it, kicking it in the face. Don't you dare try and eat my chef. Luffy growled at it as well, punching it in the jaw, knocking it down. Just what type of monsters are you guys? Yusaku asked, looking at Luffy and Sanji, who both stared at the giant fish cow. The Sanji. Luffy said, a look of glee crossing his face that Sanji had come to know wasn't a very good thing. Back home I heard that some people use Sea Kings to pull their ships. If we tie some rope to this guy's horns, maybe we could get to Nami faster. Luffy said the idea, but all Sanji heard was, get to Nami faster, so he was all in for this idea. Sounds good, Captain. He saluted, running to get the rope. You guys really are crazy, Yusaku said as Luffy just laughed, not denying that at all. X. Usopp was running for his life, which was actually pretty normal at times. He had saved a man from being killed by one of the fishmen, and even though he knew what he did was a good thing, he really didn't feel like dying before getting to the Grand Line. Of all the times I need Luffy, he isn't here to help me. Usopp almost screamed as he tried to get away from the fishmen that were chasing him. I know, I need to hide somewhere. Usopp thought his idea was quite clever as he jumped into a bush and tried to still himself as much as possible, so they walked on by. Damn, that long-nosed human sure can run. One of them said while the other nodded and continued on looking for him. I actually did it, Usopp said in wonder as he saw the fisherman leave him all alone in that bush. That was lucky. A voice said, leaning on a tree, causing Usopp to jump from the bush and point his slingshot at the woman. You scared me. He said, taking a deep breath to calm his beating heart. Sorry, but the fact that you got away after a stunt like that is a miracle at best. She said, but smiled at him, brushing a strand of purple hair back. My name is Najiko. What is an outsider like you doing here on this island? She asked him seriously because not many people came here anymore. We're here to help a friend, Usopp said carefully, not too sure if he could trust this woman or not. I see, it's best we take this somewhere else, though she knew that the fishermen would be on the lookout for this guy now that he had attacked one of their own. My house isn't too far from here, so why don't we talk there? She said, and Usopp nodded in agreement, not wanting to be caught out in the open right now. Who's this friend that you're trying to help? She asked as Usopp followed behind her. Oh, her name's Nami. Usopp said, but missed the way Najiko's eyes widened in surprise. Nami, huh? She whispered softly. Nami is one of our nakama, and our captain said she asked for our help, so who are we to turn our back on her? Najiko suppressed a smile, but barely. That's interesting. Najiko knew Nami didn't ask for help, so for this guy to say she did was rather surprising to her. She told us to look for her sister, but with all the mess that happened I guess we got a bit sidetracked. Usopp admitted, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. Oh, and did she give you her sister's name? Najiko asked, humor in her voice. Nah, she said that she would find us first. Najiko laughed at that because that was a Nami thing to say. She was right, so let's talk about this a little later, okay? She smiled as Usopp's mouth dropped a little bit, so he just nodded and followed her the rest of the way to her home. Once Usopp got there, he couldn't help but look around because this was the place Nami might have grown up in. So you're really Nami's sister? Usopp asked, wanting to clarify that information. Are you really her nakama? Najiko asked, countering him, but Usopp didn't pause to even think about the answer. Of course. He said as Najiko felt the conviction in his voice. What is she like when she's with you guys? She asked him, walking towards a picture that held a good memory for her. She laughs a lot but is really scary. She keeps us together. I mean, we've got a really childish captain that's really strong. If we didn't have Nami we'd probably be able to fight people still, but we'd probably end up lost along the way, he said, smiling at his little family. She laughs, Hanajiko said, putting the picture down. Looking out the window she turned to Usopp. Do you know the kind of trouble she causes people? She needed to make sure they knew they might have been used. Yeah. Usopp said, quickly startling Najiko. Well, kinda, actually Luffy knows a lot more than I do, but Nami said she needs help, so we'll help her no matter what. Usopp wasn't Luffy and couldn't promise to kick people's asses, but he would promise to help her kick some ass. He just didn't want to be the one to start the fighting. I see, Najiko said, smiling, now glad to know Nami had met some good loyal people, but more importantly that Nami had begun to open her heart again. Luffy's here. Usopp said, standing up, looking out the window. Now Najiko watched him carefully. You mean you can see him? She asked, looking out the window as well, but Usopp shook his head. You can always tell when Luffy's nearby, Usopp started. Najiko watched silently, not understanding, because when Luffy arrives somewhere he brings with him this weird feeling like anything could be possible. He also knew that his observational skills were getting sharper the longer he was with Luffy and Zoro. Shall we go meet him then? She asked, and Usopp nodded in excitement. Probably best we find the rest of the crew as well. If they're here, we have a swordsman who's supposed to be resting, but knowing him we'll be searching for days before he turns up. Usopp laughed, walking out the door, leaving a confused and intrigued Najiko behind him to follow. What strange friends you've discovered, Nami. X. Whoa. How do we get this shitty thing to slow down? Sanji yelled, holding onto the railing as the sea cow began to drag them towards the island at an alarming pace. Shishishi, who cares? Faster. Luffy shouted in glee as the other two held on. I think I might be sick. Yusaku shouted as the sea cow flung them in the air towards the island. Luffy closed his eyes, loving the feeling of the wine through his hair, just like when he was a child. Suddenly the ship began to drop from the air. This isn't going to be fun, Luffy. If we survive I'm going to kill you. Sanji screamed as they hit land and dragged into a few trees. Luffy jumped off the ship once it had stopped, dodging a kick to the head with ease. Get back here, Luffy, and take your punishment like a man. Sanji yelled, jumping off as well as Yusaku slowly began to pull himself back together. What, it's not like this was all my idea, you know. Luffy whined a bit, then blinked because it looked like Zoro was under his foot. Luffy, it growled as Luffy came to the conclusion that it truly was Zoro he had just stepped on. Ah, sorry. He said, rubbing his head, placing his hat on at the same time. Where the hell did you guys come from? Zoro growled out at them, Sanji taking notice of the swordsman. Oh look, it appears we ran over a bowl of moss. He said, looking down at Zoro with a bored expression on his face, lighting up a new smoke. Who's the swirl brow? Zoro asked, pointing his thumb at the blonde. He's our cook. Luffy said cheerfully before running towards what looked like a path. Swirl brow? Sanji growled out as Zoro stood up. Sorry, would you prefer dartboard? Zoro asked him seriously, only to get a kick aimed at him, so he blocked it with his sword. Stupid ball of moss. Sanji growled under his breath as Zoro smirked. Boy. Stop fighting and let's go find Nami. He was waving his arms at them, trying to get their attention. I'll deal with you later, Nami comes first. Sanji said, dropping his leg, glaring at Zoro. Luffy, Usopp, and Johnny might be with her. Zoro said, since he did wake up on the Mary. You guys actually caught up to her? Luffy asked in mild surprise, and Zoro smirked. Yeah, we did. He was looking at the new cook, rubbing in that he got to meet up with Nami first before him. We had our own problems to deal with. Sanji said, biting down on his smoke. Excuses. Then they couldn't have gone far. Luffy began to look around, walking along the trail, hoping to run into anyone. Luffy continued down the trail until he saw what he was looking for. Usopp waving frantically at his friend. Usopp began to run towards Luffy, happy. And here I thought you'd never show up. Usopp said to Luffy, a large smile on both their faces. Now you know that's a lie. Luffy chuckled as Najiko watched the both of them carefully. Oh, what an outstanding beauty I see before me. Sanji swirled towards Najiko, hearts in his eyes as the woman just watched him. Who are you? Luffy asked her as Usopp introduced her to the others. You're Nami's sister? Luffy asked, wanting her to verify that information. I am. Do you boys even know what's happening on this island? She asked them as they all shook their heads. I'm only here because Nami asked for help, she's my navigator. He said, making sure she knew that Nami was with them as their nakama. Do you really expect to go up against Arlong without knowing anything? Are you all stupid? She asked them. Yusaku and Johnny had met up again somewhere along the way and nodded in agreement with Najiko at their stupidity for wanting to take on Arlong. Let me tell you the story of Nami and the story of what has happened on this island. She said to them, but Luffy crossed his arms over his head and walked to a tree to nap. No thanks, if she wants to tell me anything I'll listen, but that's her choice. Luffy said, not caring about someone's past unless it came straight from their mouths. Completely ignoring the group and letting sleep take over him, Luffy thought a nice relaxing sleep would be great before a battle, but he was wrong. The moment sleep took over Luffy, a strange nightmare crept into his mind. Luffy was looking around what appeared to be Thatch's room. On the bed he saw himself so young and Thatch standing up talking angrily with Teach. Teach? I thought you were supposed to be on watch. Thatch said confused. Luffy felt like he wanted to interfere knowing what was coming. I am commander, I was wondering though, just what are you going to do with that devil fruit of yours? He asked Thatch, a slick grin on his face. Luffy himself began to shout at Thatch to slam the door in the man's face, but his voice was silent, no one could hear him no matter how loud he screamed. I'm going to throw it into the damn sea now, get out. Thatch yelled, pushing Teach back, but it didn't do much. Luffy tried to help his brother, but his hands moved right through the large man, so all he could do was watch as Teach stabbed Thatch, pushing him to the ground. Luffy leaned down to check on his bleeding brother, his hands passing through the older man. Luffy knew now that he was older, that Thatch was going to be alright, but seeing this now, remembering it, really hurt. This isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real, Luffy said to himself, but like before his voice had no sound to it. I'll be taking this, commander. Teach said, picking up the box that held the devil fruit. Take it and rot, bastard. Luffy thought, glaring hard at the man who had turned his attention to the smaller Luffy on the bed, who was shaking in fear. Thanks for not screaming, little Luffy, you really helped me out, zahahaha, he laughed before leaving. Bastard. Luffy shouted as the man left the room, the door fully closed as darkness took over Luffy's mind once again. Waking up with a start, a cold sweat was on his brow as he took slow sharp breaths, trying to calm himself down. Zoro was sleeping beside him by the tree, but his breath was even and his eyes opened slightly, looking at Luffy from the corner of his eye. Shifting slightly, Zoro brushed his shoulder onto Luffy's in a comforting manner. I'm okay, Luffy said, but Zoro refused to move from his new place. Standing up, everyone looked at Luffy, who didn't make eye contact, just announced he was going for a walk. That was strange, Usopp said, watching Luffy's back, but Zoro was staring harder, worry on his face, not used to seeing Luffy like this. They'll be fine, please continue, Negico Swan. Sanji said, heart still there, but Zoro's eyes remained in the direction Luffy had walked. Stupid. I haven't thought about that in years, so why now? Luffy asked himself out loud as he kept going on the trail, not really seeing where he was going, just walking. Luffy, he looked up, bringing his mind back when he saw Nami running towards him fast. Nami? You actually came. She sounded surprised, so he took a bit of offense to that tone. I said I would. He let her hear the hurt in his voice. I know, it's just, no one had ever cared enough before to chase after her. She took a look at him and frowned. You okay? She asked him, seeing how pale he was, also how he looked away from her at those words. Yeah, I just had a bad dream, that's all. He said, but she didn't look away from him. It must have been pretty bad to scare you of all people. And if it did scare him, she knew it would have had a worse effect on her. I'm alright, just haven't had dreams like that in a while, he said as they walked together a bit. Luffy, listen, she started as he stopped walking. I want to try and do this on my own first. She said to him as he raised a brow. I needed to collect a lot of money to free my village, and I've done it. I can do this first, Luffy, and then you can step in, she said, but Luffy frowned at her. Nami, you asked for my help. He needed her to let him help her, but he wouldn't force her. I know, but not just yet, just a little bit more time, I promise. She said, and Luffy nodded, but still didn't like it. Maybe it was because of the dream he had, but a weird feeling was settling in his stomach and he wasn't sure he liked it or not. Sighing, he smiled at her kindly. Alright, but you know where to find us if you need us. He said, getting her to smile before she ran off towards Arlong Park. I'll at least check out the village, there's gotta be something interesting around here until I can fight. He said, continuing his walk all alone. He got to the village and saw a bunch of people getting angry about something, but it wasn't his place to step in, so he found the closest tree and sat down under it. Should I try for another nap? He asked himself, but growled a little at the very idea of another nightmare, especially one with that bastard in it. Maybe I'll just not sleep, but try and sleep. He said, nodding to himself, happy to have come to a good decision before closing his eyes once again. Negico had left the group alone since they had made it pretty clear that they weren't going to back off from Arlong. We won't do anything until we've been given the okay to do so. Sanji said, blowing smoke, but smiling. Luffy is our captain, so it's his orders we're waiting on, but since he's decided to take a walk, we'll have to wait, I guess. Usopp sighed as Negico smiled. Then I'll leave you alone for now. She wasn't going to force them to leave since they clearly weren't going to, but she wasn't going to encourage them any further either. If they wanted to fight Arlong, then they could do that on their own. Thank you for telling us the story of this island, Miss Negico. Usopp said to her as she laughed, giving a wave as she walked away. To think that Nami has suffered so much for all those years, Sanji said, taking a deep inhale of smoke to calm his nerves. This entire island has suffered. Usopp looked around, but even in the shining sun he could feel the sadness in this place. We should go find Luffy. Zoro said, standing up from where he had been sitting pretending to sleep while he thought about what was wrong with his captain. He said he was going for a walk, and this is Luffy, he'll be fine. Usopp said, but Zoro wasn't listening as he began to walk away. Damn it, Zoro. You can't go off by yourself. Usopp shouted after the man, who looked back and grunted at him in half anger and half confusion. We don't have all year to look for you when you get lost. He finished as Zoro shouted back at him. Oh? The moss head can't even take a walk without someone to hold his hand? Sanji asked, looking at Zoro, who was ready to bring out his blade to shut this newcomer up once and for all. Oi, can't we save the fighting for later? Usopp said, trying to calm the argument that was brewing. Luffy is probably waiting for us, so let's go already. Usopp knew the word Luffy could stop Zoro momentarily, but he wasn't sure if it would stop Sanji. Fine. Zoro said, because he was worried for his friend, but mark his words, he would cut that cook later. I wonder where he went off to, Sanji said, looking down the trail. And Johnny and Yusaku have wandered off as well. Usopp looked around, not seeing the other two people that were in their group. Well, whatever, you said we should go find Luffy, so let's do that. Sanji looked up to the darkening sky, thunder rolling in the distance. Let's go before the storm hits. X. Luffy was coming back from a nice dreamless sleep when he heard the chaos around him. What do you mean? A woman shouted, causing Luffy to open his eyes slightly and stare at the scene in front of him. Nijiko's been shot by the Marines, another said, causing a roar from others around. The Marines have been bought out by Arlong, there's nothing we can do, someone said as Luffy frowned and stood up, going over to see what was going on. Now what's the problem? He asked a few people who had never seen him before. Who are you? They demanded at him, so he replied in the Luffiest way possible. I'm Luffy, Nami's friend. He said, and they stared at him. You're really a friend of Nami's? A man with a pinwheel on his hat asked, and Luffy nodded, smiling wide. Man, she asked me to come here to help. He was never good at hiding his intentions from people. Then you probably know her older sister was just shot. Someone said as Luffy blinked. But I thought that lady was with my friends. She must have left, I guess. He didn't know how long he had been napping for. While everyone was freaking out, Usopp, Zoro, and Sanji had found where Luffy had been while they were talking. About time we found you. Zoro said, but he was giving Luffy a look only they knew. I'm alright. Luffy answered his friend, who nodded but still stood by him. What's wrong with everyone? Usopp asked, crossing his arms and looking around, taking in the scene of angry people. When did Nami's sister leave you guys? Luffy asked suddenly, causing the small group to look at him in question. Just shortly after you left for your walk. Sanji said, thinking about it. She had finished her tale and warned them a little, but then left. Why was it a big deal to Luffy? Apparently she was shot. Luffy said as everyone froze, even Zoro stilled and eyes narrowed at the information. Was it Arlong? Sanji questioned, already not liking the fishman. I heard it was the Marines, Luffy replied, but they all fell silent as Nami came into view with Nijiko following beside her, bandages wrapped around her middle, her arm over the injury protecting it. Stay here. Luffy ordered, walking towards Nami, who wasn't thinking straight right now. Nami? Luffy said, walking up to her, but she ignored him as the town people began to become enraged. Everyone, don't worry. It'll all be okay, I promise. She said, but the look in her eyes froze Luffy in his tracks, anger filling his entire being. Nami, a few people said in sadness. How dare that man take advantage of you and all your hard work? One shouted. Arlong never intended to free her at all. He was just using her. Someone else shouted as Nami shook her head. It's alright, honest, I can just gather it all up again really, and it's not that big a deal. She tried to reason with herself and the others, but Luffy wasn't having any of it. You know what you need to really do, Nami. Luffy said, crossing his arms and standing beside Zoro. Luffy wouldn't act unless she gave him permission, and he would wait for as long as she liked. Nami, we can no longer allow you to sacrifice yourself for this village. A man said, who had scars all over his body. He's right, Nami, you've got some pretty good friends here now, so go with them and be free. You have a dream, don't waste it on us. Nijiko said, standing beside the man as the villagers began to gather any kind of weapon they could to face Arlong. I won't let you. Nami had snapped, something in her was breaking down as she pulled out a knife, pointing it at the man. You can't stop us, Nami, so go. He said, grabbing the knife, showing his resolution to fight Arlong, then walked past her with the villages and Nijiko to fight the fishmen. Nami fell to her knees, her eyes wide, and whatever was left of her control faded and snapped as she grabbed her arm where a tattoo lay in anger. At Markets, Luffy knew of pirate marks, heck, he had one of his own on his lower back. Arlong. she shouted in anger, her eyes turning towards the knife on the ground as she grabbed it and began to hack at her arm, shouting his name. Luffy realized quite quickly that the place she was attacking was the mark on her shoulder. If Luffy didn't like this fisherman before, he really hated him now. A pirate mark was meant to show that you belonged to a family. Much like his mark showed his love for his ma and pops and the others he called his family, Nami's appeared to be the exact opposite of that. Nami's mark appeared to be one more towards pain rather than love, which sickened Luffy. Having enough of her actions, Luffy grabbed her wrist, no longer allowing her to harm herself any more than she had. Luffy, she looked back at him, his hat overshadowing his face, but his mouth in a straight line showing hardly any emotions. Nami dropped her hand, letting the knife fall to the dirt road, her anger spent, but the deep sadness still there. Luffy, I worked so hard, I'm such a fool for trusting that he'd keep his word. I can't believe that I honestly thought I could do this on my own. She cried out, but Luffy remained silent, letting her say all she needed to. You have no idea about anything that's happening here on this island. You don't truly know of the things I've suffered through for the past 8 years, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, but Luffy once again remained silent, waiting for her to give him permission. Even the others who were watching from a distance were waiting for Luffy's orders. Luffy, please help me, she said, looking back at him, so he did what he knew needed to be done. Taking his hat off his head, he placed it upon Nami's orange hair, startling the girl. I already said I would, didn't I? He asked her, and she nodded, pulling the hat tighter upon her head protectively. Everyone, let's go. Nami watched as Luffy and the others began their walk towards Arlong Park. Touching the straw hat that sat on her head, she tried to hold back another round of tears at the symbolic meaning this hat held. This hat was Luffy's treasure, and here he was entrusting it to her as he marched on to fight her demons. Luffy. She whispered, her eyes set in the direction he and the others were walking. This day was one to be remembered in the eyes of this island because of what Luffy will do here, but for her it held another meaning. Today was the day her small ragtag friends with different goals and personalities just might have truly become a crew. Here they are, ready to fight for me and my village, my family, and I'm just sitting here crying. Nami scolded herself, lightly placing her hand on her bloody arm and wincing at the sudden sharp pain she hadn't felt before. Standing up, she walked towards a house she knew the doctor had lived and searched for some bandages and cleaning ointments to hold herself together for now, since she didn't have time to just sit here and do nothing, not when her nakama were about to go into battle. The way to Arlong Park was silent, but you could feel in the air something was coming. The clouds were dark, threatening a storm above, but the rain feared falling on this group of angry pirates. The villagers waited at the gate reluctantly because they had been blocked off by none other than Yasaku and Johnny. You don't understand, we have reason to fight. The man with the pinwheel on his hat shouted at the beaten and bloody pair who were blocking their way with their swords. No, you guys don't understand. We came here to fight for Nami sis. After hearing her sad story, we lost by a hair, but we know a few people that won't. They said, looking at the villagers who were quite confused by their words. Who would be brave enough to fight Arlong? Someone shouted in the crowd as the men smiled. Them. Luffy and his group were coming over the hillside, but Luffy stopped walking to turn back, suddenly surprise in his expression as Nami came running towards them. Nami, he said, looking at her carefully, but she took a few deep breaths before looking up at him, her eyes strong, though red-rimmed from her tears. I'm fighting with you, she said as Luffy tried to convince her to let him and the others fight and her to rest. This is my battle more than it is yours, Luffy. Let me fight to protect my family, she said seriously to him, knowing the word family would catch his heart, and it worked. Protect my hat while you fight, I want it back in good condition, he said, turning away and looking at the crowd watching them. Luffy left his hat with Nami because he knew that if she had it, she would do anything to protect it, causing her to be a bit more careful and less into the danger. You guys. Nijiko said, looking at them, surprised as well that Nami was walking beside them at the end, a fierce determination in her to fight and win back her home, and this time she'd do it with the strength of her family, her nakama. We were waiting for you to come, Johnny said, their swords crossed together as Zoro looked down at them, not smiling though his mind in battle mode. I'll be taking these, he said, simply grabbing the blades from the ground to use since his own two were destroyed by Mihawk. Once Zoro had his swords and the crowd had parted, Luffy punched the wall down to Arlong Park and walked past the rubble towards the many startled fishermen. Oh, it looks like we have some company, Arlong said, carefully leaning back on his chair and looking Luffy over. The kid didn't look that strong, but the hole in his wall proved otherwise, so he eyed the boy, but his eyes wandered over to the straw hat sitting on top of Nami's head. Nami, care to explain? He asked her, but it sounded more like a threat. No longer will you reign over this island, she shouted at him, being beside Luffy, and the others had given her a new form of strength. Oh? And who do you expect will change that? Arlong asked sarcastically as his group laughed along with him. I will. Luffy stepped forward, looking the man over. And who are you exactly? Arlong asked the boy who wasn't smiling. I'm Luffy. He said before moving faster than expected and decking Arlong in the face, sending him backwards into the wall. And I'm here to kick your ass for hurting my navigator and making her cry. Luffy said to him as Arlong got back up, pissed off at this brat. So you've actually decided to betray me, Nami, Arlong said to the girl who pulled out her wooden rod and pointed it at him. Betray? I was never your nakama from the start. She yelled, the straw hat on her head fluttering carefully. A few of the stronger fishermen walked forward, standing in between Arlong and the small group of pirates. So you think you can come in here and take my navigator away? Arlong asked Luffy as Zoro jumped to take on the octopus fisherman and Sanji stepping in to take on another, removing them from Luffy's path. Usopp shot his slingshot at the one fisherman that had chased him earlier as Nami pointed her staff at him as well. I'll back you up, Usopp, she said, but he looked at her from the corner of his eye. That's what I wanted to say, damn it. Even though he was a bit stronger, there was no way he wanted to fight any of the fishermen in any way at all. Take her. She's not a piece of property, Luffy said. Ever since his nightmare, Luffy's been on slight edge, so being near a man who treated Nami, his friend, like a possession really pissed him off more. The octopus man jumped away from Zoro for a moment and trumpeted loudly as a familiar face came into view. Oh, so it's just you, Luffy said as Sanji stopped and even looked at the cow with a rather bored expression. Kill them. The cow was ordered, but the moment it set its eyes on both Luffy and Sanji, it tried to turn tail to escape. Oh? Running away, are you? Arlong asked in a cold voice as the cow froze. What, it's not like that thing can beat me or anything, Luffy said, crossing his arms as Arlong growled at Luffy. Kill them, Mamu. The octopus guy shouted as it roared at Luffy and the others before diving at them. Luffy started to push and knock a bunch of the weaker fishermen out of his way as Sanji ran quickly past his own opponent, nodding at Luffy, letting him know he's helped with the dismissal of this overgrown meal. Gomu Gomu no, Luffy began as he stopped and grabbed the sea king by its horns and winding himself up. Don't get yourself stuck, shithead, Sanji yelled as Luffy held it down, then began to unwind himself, flinging it into the air, knocking fishermen out of the way while he did it. Sanji jumped onto the sea king once it was in the air and began to give it some of his kicks before knocking it back into the water unconscious. I didn't come here to fight any of your stupid friends, the one I want to fight is you, Luffy shouted at Arlong, who was looking downright pissed at this point. That sounds perfect, because I was thinking about how much I would really like to kill you, Arlong said to Luffy, standing back up. He's mine to fight, can you guys take care of the rest? Luffy asked his crew, who nodded, or in Zoro's case smirked. I thought you'd never ask, Zoro said as the octopus guy pulled out his swords, glaring hard at Zoro as he tied his bandana around his head, preparing for a good fight. Sanji took his own opponent, angry with the words he was saying about Nami. Nami ignored the man's words, her attention focused on the one man who was looking at Usopp. You ran fast before, but can you do it again, Chu? He asked as Usopp did feel the need to run. I. Usopp began as Nami moved in beside him. It's a bit cluttered here, Usopp, let's take this elsewhere. She grabbed his arm and pulled him out of Arlong Park with the fishmen hot on their heels, but Nami had a plan of her own. What are you people doing here? The fishman asked, stopping to look at the villagers who flinched back away from him. Everyone, Nami said, stopping and looking back at her friend's worry on her face. Firebird's star, Usopp shouted, sending a flaming star at the man, causing him to look back at Usopp and Nami in anger. When I catch you both, I'm going to kill you, he shouted and began to chase them once more. I really hate people like you, Luffy said, looking at Arlong, who began to laugh. And why should I care what type of people you hate? He asked Luffy as the boy threw a punch at the fishman, only for Arlong to catch it, pulling Luffy towards him and biting his wrist. I hate people like you, Arlong whispered to him before picking him up, looking towards the water. Last time I checked, fruit users can't swim, he said loudly as Luffy began to try and wiggle out of Arlong's grasp. Put me down, you bastard, Luffy shouted, alerting Zoro that Luffy needed him. The swordsman turned to run around the octopus guy but was blocked off by him instead. Move out of my way, Zoro growled, only for the fishman to block him more. Useless as always, Sanji shouted at Zoro, who growled back at his rival. Sanji kicking the fishman, fighting him, dazing him slightly. Sanji moved swiftly and kicked Arlong in the shoulder, moving his way down the man's arm, causing him to lose his grip on Luffy, setting him free. Why you? Arlong said, looking at Sanji while Luffy regained his footing. Thanks, Sanji. He was grateful for his friends. I sure picked one hell of a guy to follow, Sanji said, taking a puff of his smoke and looking back at the other man he was supposed to fight. Now where were we? Sanji asked the man, who glared but didn't say anything in return. Nami and Usopp ran until they reached a field of rice plantation. So you have a plan, Nami? Yusuf asked her, taking deep breaths and walking backwards, staring at the puckered-lipped fishman who was looking more and more pissed by the second. "Yeah, we fight," she said to him, causing Yusuf to growl at her. "You're not Luffy." He then stared at the hat sitting on her head, though wondering if it caused its wearers to become simple-minded. "Obviously I'm not. I just know that if we don't fight we're never going to win," she shouted at Yusuf, who got his slingshot ready. "Nami, how could you betray us like this after all we've been through, Chew?" the fishman said, but Nami made a disgusted face. "Betray? How could I betray someone who I never considered my nakama?" she asked him, pointing her staff towards him as he growled at her, glaring hatefully. "You tell him, Nami." Yusuf cheered as the fishman began to charge at her, but Yusuf shot his slingshot at him, causing him to fall back a few steps. "I've got your back, Nami." It was his job after all to watch the backs of the people he called his friends. "Right, I'll be counting on you," she said, grateful to be fighting with him for her freedom. "Now this is for all those years." Sanji was feeling proud at the kick he had gotten in on the Arlong man, how he wished though that he could have kicked him more for making the beautiful Nami cry, but at least one hit was a bit satisfying. Sanji was daydreaming and overthinking as his opponent hit him hard, throwing him into the water, surprising him. Luffy calling out to him was all he heard as the water surrounded him. "Now that man will be shown the great difference between fishmen and humans by one of my brothers," Arlong said as Luffy glared at him hard. "I'm really confused," Luffy said simply, which caused Arlong to laugh some more. "Such a typical stupid human, of course you're confused. We fishmen are far greater than you weak humans," he said, but Luffy shook his head. "I'm confused that someone so ugly could come from an island so beautiful." Arlong stopped laughing now as Luffy looked at him. "A human like you has been to my home," he shouted, but Luffy didn't laugh or smile. "My brother Namor was born on Fishman Island, and let me tell you he's so much cooler than you'll ever be," Luffy said to the fishman, pissing him off. "Namor? I've never heard of him," Arlong said, not really thinking that hard about it, but Luffy smirked. "And he's probably never heard of you. I mean, you may have been from paradise, but your time here in the East has dulled your reputation," Luffy taunted. Arlong gritted his teeth in anger. "Luffy, are you just going to stand around all day and talk or actually kick some ass?" Zoro shouted at Luffy, who laughed back at his first mate. Sorry, I'll get on that now," Luffy said before pulling his arm back and punching Arlong in the chest, but before he could give the fishman a chance to recover, Luffy had begun his Gatling gun attack, knocking him through a wall. Luffy waited for a second and frowned. Don't tell me that was all it took. He was worried that clown guy Boggy Buffy, oh whatever his name was, could be stronger than this guy. "Don't make me laugh, was that all you've got, human?" Arlong pushed the rubble off of himself and looked at Luffy, who began to crack his knuckles, happy that he still had a chance to fight. "Nope, that was just a warm-up," Luffy said, blankly ready to keep going. "I see. Nami hit the fishman with her staff as hard as she could be. She wasn't stupid enough to think that might actually beat him. "Usopp, a little more help would be great," she shouted at him, because even though he was brave, he wasn't that brave. "Actually, Nami, I'm thinking I'm coming down with the runaway and never look back disease. It's highly contagious, so I'm going to hide over here for a while if that's okay with you," Usopp said, suddenly running behind a tree, but had his slingshot ready just in case. "And here I thought you were a brave warrior," she scoffed, hitting the fishman again. "I am a warrior, I just prefer to fight from over here," he yelled at her as the fishman just stared at Nami and Usopp. "What weaklings," the fishman said, deciding that he didn't even need to fight them when his brothers were fighting people like Roronoa Zoro. "How will you ever be able to stand by Luffy's side as one of his crewmates if all you do is hide?" Nami snapped at Usopp, catching the boy's attention finally. "Nami," but she had turned her back and pointed her staff at Usopp, her eyes firm. "If we can't even beat one enemy, then we aren't worthy to be a part of his crew," Nami said to him, and Usopp looked down, not being able to meet her eyes. "Then it looks like if I'm going to be on this crew I have to get a lot stronger. Luffy, when we're 17 we'll have to be strong enough for anything," Usopp said, and Luffy grinned. "Right, we'll take the Grand Line by storm," Luffy said, giving his hand out to Usopp, who grabbed hold of it tightly. "And we'll make the world remember our names." "Wait, you stupid fish," Usopp suddenly yelled, stepping away from the trees, making Nami smile, because Usopp was coming back to the semi-brave man she had met with Luffy. Pulling out a special piece of ammunition, Usopp loaded it into his slingshot and fired it as the man turned onto Nami in anger. "Sake Star," Usopp shouted, letting it fly, hitting the fishman head on, coating him in the alcohol. "Sake?" he asked, and even Nami was confused. "Last one I've got, Firebird Star," he shouted, sending the flaming bullet at the man, which once the star hit the sake it burst into a big fire. "Nami now," he shouted as the fishman was distracted. She turned quickly and whacked the fishman in the head, causing him to fall to the ground and not move. We did it," Usopp shouted, and even Nami was happy. "Now let's get back to Luffy." Nami said in happiness as Yusuf puffed up his chest in pride. I didn't even need you at all. He said to her, beginning to walk away, but he heard a groan, causing both of them to freeze as Yusuf grabbed the wooden rod from Nami's hands and continuously smacked the man until he was down for sure. Don't you think that was a bit much? She asked him, looking at her now broken rod. I may have panicked a bit, but never fear. I'm not so much of a coward that I would kill a man. Yusuf said as Nami shook her head at him. You were very brave. She complimented as he rubbed the back of his head. If I want to stand beside Luffy, I guess I have no other choice but to be. Yusuf said, looking down the trail that would lead them back to where Luffy was fighting. Don't forget though that it's okay to be scared sometimes. She said, but laughed when she realized Yusuf's knees were shaking at the thought of having to now join in and help the monsters of his crew. Yes, scared sometimes. I don't know what you're talking about, Nami, Yusuf said as she shook her head. Come on, let's go see if we can help any at all. X. Zoro and the octopus guy stared at one another, wondering who should be the first to move. The octopus guy, who turned out to be called Hachi, was a user of 8 swords, but for Zoro it didn't matter, he would defeat this fishman no matter what. I don't care what you can do, not even death can take me until I'm strong enough to beat that man. Mihawk passed through Zoro's mind. The octopus guy came at Zoro with his swords ready and swinging as Zoro closed his eyes, letting his body relax and his observation reach out. Bending his body, Zoro was able to miss the swinging blades as well as stop the fishman from moving any further. I've trained hard to match up to not only my captain but to the man I want to beat. Someone like you can never stand in our way. Zoro growled, bringing his blades up and around, calling out his attack, slicing Hachi down the middle. How dare you? I'm really going to kill you now. I've got 8 swords and you've only got 1. Hachi yelled at Zoro, who didn't even turn around as he caught the fishman's attention. You've made a major mistake on judgment because not even a single one of your blade can ever be as heavy as mine. Zoro said to him, finally turning around, his bandana covering his eyes, blackening the silver. Catching the blades with his own 3, Zoro glared up at the fishman, the silver in his eyes reflecting off of his swords. Do you understand now? My swords will always be so much stronger. Zoro said, breaking all 8 of the swords as the fishman yelled out, dropping the dead broken blades and began to try and punch Zoro instead. Only a fool would give a swordsman his arms. Zoro said before using another attack, this time finishing up the fishman. Sorry, but you mean nothing to me. Zoro said as Arlong watched one of his brothers fall, anger and shock in his face. Zoro put his katana away carefully and slowly to show the full impact of his skills. Now that's how you fillet a fish. Zoro whispered to himself, looking at the water where that stupid cook was splashing around. Sanji realized that being in the water probably wasn't a good idea. 1, because he couldn't kick as well through the water, but also because this man was a lot faster than him and could breathe apparently. The fishman seemed to realize that Sanji was weak in the water and took full advantage of this, which made things harder for Sanji. Even though his kicks were so much stronger than normal people's kicks, they didn't mean shit if he couldn't land one on this piece of shitty fish. Having trouble breathing? He asked Sanji, who had been beaten around by the fishman, who was smiling at the pain Sanji was in. Sanji took another hit, but instead of facing yet another defeat, he tried to run up the wall to escape the water and get some air in his burning lungs. Of course, this was seen quite clearly by the fishman, who cornered the panicking Sanji. I don't know why you're fighting so hard. Is it for Nami? That traitor deserves the death Arlong will give her. Is it for your friends? Humans are the weakest of them all, your rubber friend is no different, and Arlong will kill him soon as well. The fishman smirked at Sanji once more before adding the word strong enough to piss the blonde chef off completely. You can't protect anyone. Sanji's eyes widened in anger at those words. He had left his restaurant home to sail with his rubber brain captain, who was now fighting for the freedom of the beautiful Nami. Luffy only needs the best beside him, the strongest and most reliable to be in his crew. If he couldn't protect anyone, then what good was he? Something was beginning to happen in Sanji's mind. Even though he was underwater, his eyes were focusing more clearly, and even the sound of the ripples against their skin were beginning to sound loud. But he thought to himself as the fishman began to laugh. Some more bubbles burst from some marks in his neck, sounding way too loud for their small size. Suddenly Sanji had an idea as he kicked the fishman in the chest, pushing himself away slightly before biting down on the fishman's neck and jumping out of the water as fast as he could. I can breathe again. Sanji gasped as Luffy and Zoro looked his way in unmentioned ever concern. Sanji. No, you look like Sabo when your hair's wet, Luffy said in thought, avoiding another of Arlong's attacks, causing the fishman to growl at him for looking away during a fight. Shut up, you shithead. I expected you to have kicked his ass by now. Sanji yelled at Luffy, who laughed, jumping away from Arlong, who attempted to bite the bouncing teenager. Shishishi, I'm working on it. He giggled as Sanji growled, pointing his finger at the water where the fishman he was fighting was beginning to pull himself out. Get your shitty ass out of the water and let me show you just how good I really am. Sanji yelled, then removed his jacket because it was water-filled and rather heavy now. Your slow swirls, I thought you were going to beat him, not strip for him. Zoro joked, crossing his arms and looking rather unimpressed toward Sanji, who was just about to blow. He was so mad. I'm going to kill you now, Blondie. Now that you're out here, I'm going to use fishman karate to finish you off for good. The fishman said carefully to Sanji once he was out of the water and standing before Sanji, who was looking beyond pissed off. Fishman karate? Luffy asked, but Namor's style of fighting came to mind, so he smiled, knowing it would be good for Sanji to learn to fight against it. While the fishman was talking, Sanji's anger was reaching its boiling point, not only with that stupid ball of moss mocking him, but Luffy just dancing around the main dish's attack. He had just about enough of everything. Sanji jumped in even before the fishman had finished what he was saying and gave him a great kick to the head, knocking the man backwards. Even before he hit the ground or regained his footing, Sanji continued his kicks, mercilessly letting his frustration out. The fishman caught his balance and began to punch at Sanji, but it was blocked by Sanji's kicks before Sanji kicked the man in the face, then his back, forcing him to the ground. You bastard. The fishman yelled at Sanji, who then began to backflip, his foot hitting the man under the chin, then into the wall before standing straight and glaring at the now unconscious fishman. It's rather rude for a fish to be talking back to a chef, don't you think? Sanji asked before pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. Happy, Mosshead? Sanji asked Zoro, who looked away, refusing to answer that. Arlong looked around at his fallen friends in anger before Nami and Usopp appeared where the fallen wall had been. Nami caught his eyes as he turned away from Luffy and looked at her carefully. Oh, Nami, perfect timing. I've decided that to ensure you remain my cartographer forever, to just kill everyone instead and keep you alive. After all, you've really helped me out, you know. He said as Nami's eyes widened at him. Luffy was standing behind him, his eyes shadowed and angry. Thanks for not screaming, little Luffy, you really helped me out, zahahaha. Luffy was not having a good day, remembering that man again and seeing this guy and how he treated Nami made him sick. The look on both Nami and Luffy's face bothered Usopp, who brought his slingshot back and shot a rotten egg towards Arlong. Usopp, Luffy shouted, surprised to actually see him, but really should he be? That's right, I helped take down one of that guy's idiot commanders. Nami helped a bit, but I did most the work. He shouted in pride as Luffy laughed, turning his eyes back to a shocked and angry Arlong. You're like him, trying to steal someone's freedom. I hate people like you. Luffy said to Arlong, who wasn't even listening to him. How dare you? How dare you people attack my family, my brothers? He shouted at Luffy, who glared hard at him. You attacked one of my family first. Luffy then dodged a few of Arlong's attacks, avoiding being hit and even bitten. Geez, that was too close. Luffy said as he had moved his neck out of the way of Arlong's sharp teeth. A part of the building had come down. This is the power of the fishman. We are on a whole other level than you humans. He shouted as Luffy fisted his hand and punched a wall beside him, causing it to fall around him just like the other. I can make walls crumble just as easy as you can, don't think you're special because of that. I know plenty of amazing fishmen who are 10,000 stronger than you and a lot nicer as well. Luffy said as Arlong growled. Human sympathizers are nothing but weaklings. Arlong growled and attacked, but Luffy dodged yet again. Jinbei can never be called weak. Luffy yelled at him, causing him to freeze to a name he had known of so well. Jinbei, what does he have to do with someone like you? Arlong asked, eyeing the kid now, who was just staring at him. Jinbei is one of my nakama, or at least he will be. He's like one of my brothers. Luffy said, happily excited to see his friend again, and this time he would ensure that he join his crew. Jinbei must be slipping if he wants to be on a crew with humans. Arlong growled, but Luffy didn't acknowledge the words as he brought his fist flying towards Arlong, knocking him back a few steps. Jinbei doesn't even matter, what's really important is the fact that you humans are weak and pathetic. What can you even really do? Ha, Arlong asked Luffy in anger, aiming his attacks at him, but Luffy was able to jump back a lot, avoiding him. You're right, I can't do that much. Luffy said, stopping now, looking Arlong in the eyes as his family filled his memory. I can't use swords properly, so I have Zoro by my side. Luffy started Vista, filling his memory, smiling. I can't cook, so I need Sanji to help make sure my crew doesn't starve. Thatch grinned, this time replacing Vista in his mind. I can't shoot well, and even my lies suck, so I need Usopp to watch my back. Aizu came into the picture this time, giving a gentle smile. And I can't even sail these seas without Nami to lead my way. Haruta winked this time. You really are a useless human, depending on everyone like that. What can you do then, rubber boy? Arlong shouted, this time catching Luffy biting down on his shoulder, blood dripping down his arm now as Luffy grabbed him by the face and began to push him off. I can kick your ass and protect my family. This time Pops and Marco filled his mind, giving him the strength to push Arlong off for sure. giving him a glare before Luffy coated his hand in armament hockey, punching him in the face, sending him flying backwards. "I shattered your teeth, shark guy." Luffy said, happy to have done that, but then his eyes took on a curious glint as Arlong removed his teeth, showing that they could just regrow in again. "That's so weird but so cool." Luffy said, thinking of an idea, his smile forming on his face. "I'm going to show you how much more superior fishmen are to humans." Arlong shouted, using his teeth to snap at Luffy, who dodged with ease, but he was so focused on the teeth and how hard it would be to grab one of them that he got caught, his side bleeding deeply now. "Damn it." Luffy grabbed the injury, staining his hands red with his own blood. "Shahaha." Arlong laughed as Luffy pulled a pair of teeth from his side, looking them over before smiling, ignoring the pain. "What are you doing?" Arlong asked in surprise and anger as Luffy put the shark teeth in his own mouth and clamped down. "See, now I'm just like you, but not as stupid," Luffy said through the teeth, but everyone around him sweat dropped at those words. Luffy then tried to do what Arlong had done and bite down on the shark, but was swatted aside easily by the large man. I guess that didn't work after all," Luffy said, sitting down, looking annoyed that his shark teeth broke. "Where'd he go now?" Luffy looked around as Usopp and Nami yelled at him that Arlong had gone into the water. "The water?" Luffy looked at the still water, but his senses could tell him Arlong was about to attack. "So you won't do it that way, huh?" Luffy smirked, waiting now for Arlong to re-show himself as the boy knew he would. "Shark on darts!" Arlong shouted, sending himself flying into the second story of Arlong Park. Luffy had stepped out of the way, avoiding the attack, but looked up at Arlong, who was smirking. "I'm surprised that you were able to dodge that attack," he said, but Luffy didn't reply to him, but Arlong began his shark attack once more, pushing Luffy into the air to dodge it. Once Luffy was in the air, he began his Gatling gun to hit Arlong, but because of his speed and the fact he was not on the ground, Luffy missed. Arlong shot at Luffy in the air, hitting him because he couldn't move properly, sending him flying, which greatly annoyed him. Grabbing Arlong, Luffy threw him to the ground before stomping on him, using a bit of armament on the bottom of his feet to push him deeper into the cement, but Arlong wasn't done just yet. "You don't know how to just stay down," Luffy whined as Arlong reached his hand into a wall and pulled out a long-edged sword and began to try and hit Luffy with it. "Swords hurt, so I won't be hit." And he meant that. Luffy had learned to dodge blades his entire life. This one was big, so it was slower and easier to move away from. "Humans drove the man I respected to his death. Jinbei is a traitor to our powerful race for joining up with the like of you stupid humans who killed that man." Arlong shouted at Luffy, but the boy was dodging the swords, so he didn't really pay attention much, and really he didn't care. Luffy got to a window and threw himself inside to catch his breath. Jumping up walls was harder than it looked. Luffy looked around the room in confusion, not sure what he was supposed to make of this place. Relaxing slightly since he knew he would be back on his feet shortly, Luffy took in everything from the many old maps to the desk hidden in the corner. "What's with this room?" Luffy looked around, but something felt off about the place. It felt cold and lonely. "This is the place where I make that woman draw her maps. You can search the world, but you'll find no one else who can draw maps like her." "Really?" Luffy said in a bored tone, because he didn't care that Nami could do perfect maps. As long as she was his friend, she could do whatever she wanted. During Arlong's little speech, a pen had fallen to the ground and rolled towards Luffy, who stared at it, his eyes overshadowed, hiding his expression from Arlong. "There'd be nothing more foolish than letting her go free," Arlong said happily as Luffy looked over the pen carefully. "This pen, it's got her blood soaked into it," he said carefully. "For Nami, this place is where she can be the happiest. She will work for me to help achieve my ambitions. She will help me chart the whole of the East Blue, and then we shall rule this world." He laughed, bringing his sword up and placing it at Luffy's throat, but the boy didn't move at all. Arlong wanted to keep laughing, but even he froze for a moment, feeling the atmosphere change in the room. Something about that boy was starting to put him off. Maybe it was the way he was so calm right now. Luffy continued to twirl the pen in his hand, thinking about it and the pain that had been caused from it. "Before I came here, I had a really bad memory of a man who tried to steal the life of one of my brothers. I wondered why I thought about him right then, why now after all these years, but now I know," Luffy said, then put the pen down. "Oh? And why should I care about your nightmares? I won't kill Nami unless she tries to run away. As of now, Nami is my nakama. No one can use her like I can. She'd be a waste to be given to a weak human like you," he said as Luffy looked up, anger in his eyes in a way none had ever seen before. Grabbing the blade in Arlong's hand, the fishman was surprised to find he could no longer move it as Luffy glared deeply at him, hate radiating off of his very being. "You're just like him. You'll use anyone to get what you want, even killing your friends for it. Nami deserves to be free from you. I couldn't stop that man as a child, but I swear I will stop you. You stop me. You humans are all the same. The only difference Nami has is that's been able to raise above your pathetic weaknesses by proving she is useful to us fishmen." Arlong shouted, but Luffy wasn't playing anymore as he broke the blade with his bare hands. Arlong flinched back at the look from the boy, and the strength shone. Luffy wasn't listening as Arlong began to explain his plans for Nami as he then stood up, his face going blank, but the feeling of anger still surrounding him, making Luffy very unpredictable. Looking at the desk in the corner, Luffy kicked it as hard as he could out through the wall, sending it flying. What? Arlong asked, confused like everyone else below, but Luffy didn't stop there. Looking at the bookshelf, Luffy then punched it through the other wall, sending it and all that was on it flying. Then he turned back and kicked the door, breaking it and the wall around it, making Arlong very angry. "What are you doing, you rubber brat?" he asked, swinging his blade down only for Luffy to dodge it, making Arlong cut through a large stack of maps. Taking it as a hint, Luffy punched a bunch more maps through the wall, sending them floating down to the ground where everyone was confused on what Luffy was doing, but Nami was crying. "My maps. Do you know how many years that girl spent working on those?" Arlong asked before aiming an attack at Luffy, who dodged yet again, punching more stuff out of the room. Arlong had enough, finally being able to grab Luffy, pinning him to the wall, but Luffy refused to let up, kicking his foot through another stack, sending them flying through a new hole. "You've gone way too far, human," Arlong said, biting down on Luffy's neck, blood dripping from the deep injury as Luffy winced but pushed against Arlong's face to get him off. "I really don't give two shits how great you and the other fishmen are. I like them, but right now these maps, this place, I don't care about it. I just know now there's only one thing left for me to do to help her," Luffy said before breaking Arlong's nose, causing the man to jump back in pain, holding the injury. "This room can't be here anymore." Luffy's eyes had taken on a wild look to them. "I'll destroy every place she doesn't want to be trapped in." Luffy yelled before shooting his foot up through the roof as Arlong realigned his nose and stood back up, glaring with as much hate at Luffy as possible. Arlong moved into another attack to finish this off, and while Luffy's leg had been through the roof, Arlong was able to bite down on the boy. Ignoring the pain, Luffy brought his foot down fast and hard, hitting Arlong in the back. A crack had been heard, but Luffy was not in the caring mood right now. Continuing to use the pressure of his foot and all of his strength, Luffy pushed Arlong down through each level of the place, bringing the entire Arlong Park down with him. Everyone was freaking out because this was the hardest they had ever seen Luffy fight, also because not a single movement had been made after the dust had cleared around the place. "Luffy." Nami whispered, her hand over her mouth in worry. No one else moved but just waited to see who had won. Finally, rocks being pushed aside caught everyone's attention as Luffy stood up, bloody and panting. "Luffy?" A few people called out. Zoro's eyes took in the damage done to Luffy and frowned, since it was his job to ensure Luffy didn't get hurt like this. "Nami?" he shouted, catching the attention of the girl, who looked at him as he took another deep breath. "You are one of us," he shouted as the tears spilled over her eyes, falling down her cheeks. "Amen," was all she could say as another wave of pure happiness went through her, bringing fresh tears. Everyone around them broke out into cheers of happiness because now they were finally free. Zoro, standing up, climbed the rubble and helped support Luffy down carefully. "I'm alright," Luffy said to his first mate, who was eyeing him. "Of course you are," was all Zoro needed to say, but even he smirked with Luffy as they got to flat ground, letting Luffy stand on his own. "Hold on a moment." Some guy wearing a mouse's hat and a marine outfit shouted. Luffy stopped and looked at him and his surrounding marines, who wore stupid smiles. "The one who will take the honor of stopping these fishmen will be me." He didn't even get to finish his sentence before Luffy punched him in the face and Zoro, using his sheathed blade, smacked him in the head. "And stay down," Zoro said, then walked away with Luffy, leaving the marine down in the dirt, then looked at the other marines, giving them his demon glare as Luffy had finished dealing with them as well. "Don't make us all angry again when things are finally looking up," Zoro growled, and Luffy laughed, glad to see his best friend relaxing a bit. Zoro worried about him too much. Nami watched Luffy's back and smiled before taking the hat off of her head and placing it on top of Luffy's. He realized his hat was back and in perfect condition like he asked. "Thanks, Luffy," she whispered before he turned around, facing her, fully a smile on his face. Welcome home, Nami. And that she was home, where she had people that cared about her so much they would beat down her demons when she couldn't. "I'm home." Later on, somewhere on the Grand Line. "So Arlong failed after all," a voice said as a shadow covered his whole body, blocking him from view. "And after we gave him all he'd need to take over the East Blue, what a shame." It continued, but a smile was on the man's face as if expecting Arlong to fail. Apparently he was defeated by a boy wearing a straw hat and his small crew. Someone said over the transponder, snail, catching the man's interest. "Does this boy have a name?" he asked as the snail went silent for a moment, the person on the other side flipping through something. "Yes, Monkey D. Luffy. Apparently his bounty was just released. I can send it to you if you wish." "That would be nice," he said, hanging up the phone and coming out of the shadows, his dirty smile stretching across his face. So little Luffy's left home, zahaha, I'll have to greet him properly, now won't I? Zahahaha. That is the end, so, thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.